She lit candles at the altar every Sunday, smiled at poets and senators, and let the greatest writer in Russia sleep under her roof, while 300 miles away, children as young as 7 were dying on her factory floor, their small bodies dumped into unmarked pits before their bones had even finished growing. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling cases where the truth hid beneath what first appeared completely harmless. What you see here is the result of extensive research, careful fact-checking, and a relentless pursuit of the truth. Nothing was added by accident. Every detail was chosen with the weight of real events in mind. This channel exists for one reason: to ensure these moments in history are never lost to time. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the Kursk Saltychika. She built churches with blood-stained hands, the monstrous double life of Olga Konstantinovna Briskorn, aka the Angel of Galernaia Street. Now let's begin. Imagine a woman so terrifyingly ordinary on the surface that no one looked twice. A socialite, a philanthropist, a widow who mourned well, remarried brilliantly, hosted the Russian elite at candlelit dinners, and funded the construction of not 1, but 3 churches. Now imagine that same woman, in a different coat, in a different province, standing over a trembling serf with a whip in her hand, ordering punishment so savage that grown men wept and children stopped speaking altogether. Imagine her watching workers collapse from starvation in the middle of their shifts, and then, rather than call a physician, docking their rations further. Imagine her keeping ledgers of her cruelty, watching the death toll climb past 10, past 50, past 100, and feeling nothing but irritation at the inefficiency of dying bodies. This is not a story from the dark pages of mythology. This is not fiction dressed in period clothing. This is the documented, investigated, and legally confirmed reality of Olga Konstantinovna Briskorn. Born Mavrigini, widowed Strakova, and finally Briskorn by her second, glittering marriage. A woman who killed at least 128 human beings between 1818 and 1822, nearly half of them children, and who was so embedded in the architecture of Russian aristocratic power that the investigation into her crimes was conducted in secret, and her punishment was softer than what any peasant would have received for stealing bread. Stay with this story, because what happened in the village of Prilopy in the Kursk governorate of the Russian Empire is one of the most chilling, most deliberately obscured, and most hauntingly documented accounts of what happens when absolute power wears a velvet glove and hides a bloodied fist underneath. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. There is something particularly unsettling about evil that is fashionable. Evil that wears fine jewelry and speaks in complete sentences. Evil that builds places of worship and weeps at theater performances and is considered, by everyone who shares her dining table, to be a woman of extraordinary refinement. That particular brand of evil is the most dangerous kind, because it is invisible until it is already too late, and because the system that produces it is designed to look the other way. Olga Konstantinovna was born in 1776 into the Mavrigini family, a line of Moldovan boyars whose name carried the weight of generations of aristocratic status. To be born Mavrigini was to be born already above the ordinary world. Privilege was not something she earned or stumbled into. It was stitched into her cradle, carved into the walls of the houses she grew up in, and whispered into her identity long before she was old enough to understand what it meant to own another human being. In the Russia of the late 18th century, serfdom was the foundation of the entire agricultural economy. Serfs were not quite slaves in the Western colonial sense, but they were not free people either. They were bound to the land, subject to the will of their masters, punishable at the landowner's discretion, and denied almost every legal protection that any other citizen, however humble, might claim. To be a serf in Russia during this era was to exist in a permanent state of legal vulnerability, your life and body technically at the disposal of whoever held the deed to the estate on which you worked. For a woman like Olga Konstantinovna, the serfs were fixtures, like furniture, like horses, like the machinery she would one day import from abroad. They were assets, and assets could be used however their owner saw fit. Her first marriage was to Anany Gerasimovich Strukov, the provincial marshal of nobility in Yekaterinoslav, and by all accounts the wealthiest man in the entire province. This was not a love match. It was a transaction of dynastic precision, the kind arranged by families who understood that marriage was a vehicle for the consolidation of land, money, and social standing. And it was spectacularly successful on every measure. Olga entered the marriage with a dowry of 56,000 rubles, a staggering sum for the era, along with extensive tracts of land, multiple households, and several hundred serfs. These were her personal possessions, brought into the union as a wealthy woman's contribution to an already wealthy household. Together, the Strukova-Strukov estate was enormous by any standard, spanning properties in Yekaterinoslav and beyond, operated by an army of bound laborers who had no say in the conditions of their existence. In Yekaterinoslav society, Olga Strukova quickly became what people described as the first lady of the province, not simply because of her wealth, but because of her personality. She was educated in a way that was unusual for women of her generation, broadly read, articulate, and possessed of a sharp, theatrical sensibility. She loved the performing arts. She participated in amateur dramatics, hosted cultural gatherings, and carried herself with the kind of effortless authority that comes from never once in your life being made to feel small. She was charming. She was clever. She was, by every external account, a woman to be admired. She was also, underneath all of that shimmer, developing something that would only become visible years later, a total and complete disregard for the lives of those beneath her. It is impossible to say exactly when the cruelty began, because by the time anyone was paying close enough attention to document it, it had already become routine. What is known is that even in the Yekaterinoslav years, Olga's treatment of her serfs was harsh beyond the already brutal norms of Russian serfdom. The legal framework of the era permitted landowners to discipline serfs physically. Flogging was not just accepted, it was expected as a management tool. But there is a spectrum even within cruelty, and accounts from the period suggest that Olga occupied the far, dark end of it from very early on. The punishments she ordered were excessive. The conditions she imposed were degrading beyond what was standard even in an era when degradation was normalized. But in Yekaterinoslav, she had enough social standing and enough powerful connections to insulate herself from scrutiny. Then her husband died. The exact date and cause of Anany Strukov's death are not prominently recorded, but the consequence is clear. Olga Konstantinovna was widowed in her 30s, and she had 3 children, Pyotr, Emmanuel, and Elizaveta. A widow of her rank and wealth was not left alone for long in the social mathematics of Russian aristocracy, and Olga did not appear to grieve excessively. Within a year of her husband's death, she relocated to St. Petersburg, the imperial capital, the glittering, frost-edged city on the Neva River that was the heartbeat of Russian political and cultural life, and began reinventing herself. In St. Petersburg, Olga Konstantinovna became someone else. Or rather, she put on a different costume over the same interior. In the capital, she was the model of respectable, even devout, femininity. She attended church regularly. She donated generously to charitable causes. She maintained a house on Galernaia Street, one of the more distinguished addresses in the city, and opened it to the city's cultural and intellectual aristocracy. At some point during this period, the family of Alexander Pushkin, the poet who would become the defining literary voice of Russian Romanticism, lived in Olga's house on Galernaia Street. This detail is not incidental. It speaks to the caliber of company she kept, the quality of her reputation, and the utter impenetrability of the facade she had constructed. You do not have Russia's most celebrated poet living under your roof unless your social standing is absolutely beyond question. Then came the second marriage. Senator Fyodor Maximovich von Brieskorn was a major official, a diplomat, and a man of significant standing in the imperial bureaucracy. Born in 1760, he was 16 years older than Olga, and the match elevated her from the ranks of wealthy provincial widow into the inner circles of metropolitan power. She became Olga Briskorn, a name that would, much later, become associated with something far more sinister than senatorial dinner parties. With Fyodor, she had two more children, Olga Fyodorovna, born in 1808, who would go on to marry into the adjutant general class and bear 8 children, and Elizaveta Fyodorovna, born in 1810, who would inherit estates and be remembered by contemporaries as a pleasant and kind woman. The contrast between the mother's legacy and the daughter's characters is one of the story's quieter, unsettling elements. In St. Petersburg, Olga Briskorn was an angel. She was photographed, metaphorically speaking, from all the most flattering angles. Her metropolitan persona was constructed with expert precision. Pious, cultured, warm, politically connected, deeply integrated into the social fabric of the capital. Whatever ugliness existed in her character was reserved entirely for the provinces, for the estates, for the serfs, for the world that the St. Petersburg drawing rooms would never see. In 1817, when she was approximately 40 years old, Olga Briskorn made a purchase that would become the stage for everything that followed. She acquired a vast estate in the Dmitrievsky district of the Kursk Governorate, a region of the central Black Earth area, fertile farmland deep in the Russian interior, far removed from the scrutiny of the capital. The estate came with land, with houses, and with the serfs bound to it, human beings whose futures were now, without their consent or any legal recourse, entirely in her hands. She was not content to simply farm the land in the conventional way. Within a year of acquiring the estate, she ordered a cloth factory to be built in the village of Prilipy. This was, on its surface, a modernizing enterprise. Briskorn imported weaving machines from abroad, machinery that was technically sophisticated and unusual for the region. She installed what was reportedly the first steam engine in the entire central Black Earth economic region. From a purely industrial standpoint, the Prilipy cloth factory was a notable achievement, a sign of someone who understood commerce and was willing to invest in modern production methods. But the factory was not built with investment capital alone. It was built on human suffering so systematic and so severe that it constitutes, by any reasonable modern legal standard, a campaign of mass murder. The workers who built it and operated it were serfs, bound laborers with no right to refuse, no right to leave, and no legal channel through which to protest the conditions imposed on them. And the conditions that Olga Briskorn imposed were not simply harsh. They were lethal. The working day in the Prilipy factory ran to 14 or 15 hours. Not occasionally, not during harvest season, but as a matter of standard, unvarying daily routine. Serfs were required to work not just on weekdays but on holidays, the days that, under the customs of the era, were supposed to belong to them, time they could use to cultivate their own small plots of land and grow food to supplement whatever meager rations they were given. By stealing their holidays, Briskorn was not simply demanding labor. She was destroying their capacity to feed themselves and their families. She was engineering starvation. When people were transferred from other parts of her estate to work in the factory, Briskorn would take away their personal property. She would confiscate what little they owned and order them to sleep on bare straw on the floor of the workshop itself. The factory was their dormitory, their dining hall, and their prison all at once. There was no separation between the place of labor and the place of rest, because there was no rest. There was only the machine, and the woman who owned the machine, and the whip that enforced its operation. The food provided to factory workers was not food in any meaningful nutritional sense. It was a performance of feeding. Enough to claim that workers were being provided for, not enough to sustain human life through 14 hours of daily industrial labor. The diet consisted of cabbage soup, a spoonful of porridge, a piece of bread, and, in a detail so grimly specific that it lodges in the memory and refuses to leave, wormy meat, divided among all workers, which amounted to approximately 8 grams per person. 8 grams. Less than the weight of a sheet of paper. This was the protein allocation for a human being performing 14 hours of physical labor in a textile factory. There were 379 people employed in this factory. Approximately 90 of them were children, not teenagers but children from the age of 7 upward. 7 years old. small enough that the physical dimensions of their bodies were incompatible with the machinery they were operating, old enough in the arithmetic of serfdom to be considered a productive unit. And these children, along with the adults working beside them, were beaten, regularly, systematically, with whips, with bats, with heavy sticks. Any slowdown in work, any sign of weakness, any failure to meet the demands of Briscorn's regime drew immediate physical punishment. The beatings were not frenzied or uncontrolled. They were ordered. They were a management technique. Olga Briscorn used violence the way other factory owners of her era used financial incentives, as a tool to drive production, to maintain control, to remind the workers at every moment that their bodies belonged to her and could be damaged at her discretion. The result of all of this, the starvation, the sleep deprivation, the physical abuse, the relentless labor without adequate rest or nutrition, was inevitably death. Not the occasional death that comes with harsh conditions. Death on a scale that constituted massacre. Between October 1820 and May 1821, a period of just 7 months, 121 workers died in the Prilapi factory. That number demands to sit on the page by itself. 121 human beings in 7 months. Among those dead were 44 children under the age of 15. 74 of the dead received proper burials, administered by a priest who recorded the deaths. The remaining 47 were buried in pits. Mass graves, unmarked, unblessed, dug somewhere on the estate grounds, their bodies disposed of like waste materials from the production process. During the same period, more than 300 serfs fled the estate. 300 people, who knew that running was an act of desperation with severe legal consequences, chose the risk of punishment as a fugitive over remaining in Prilapi. In the language of human behavior, that is the loudest possible statement about what was happening inside those walls. Olga Briscorn, meanwhile, continued to attend church, continued to maintain her reputation in St. Petersburg, continued to present herself as a woman of impeccable standing. It would be several more years before the question of justice would even be raised. To understand the full weight of what Olga Briscorn built in Prilapi, you have to resist the temptation to view it through the comfortable distance of history. The factory in the village of Prilapi was not a relic of a different moral universe. It was a place where specific human beings, with names and families and memories, woke up each morning and understood that they were trapped. They understood it with the particular, suffocating clarity of people who have no legal recourse, no external authority willing to intercede, and no physical means of escape that would not itself result in punishment. They were not passive. They were imprisoned. The geography of the Dmitrievsky district of Kursk Governorate placed Prilapi far from the imperial capital. St. Petersburg was hundreds of miles away, not just physically distant, but administratively remote. The layers of provincial bureaucracy that stood between a serf's complaint and the emperor's ear were not designed to transmit information upward. They were designed to maintain order, which in the context of serfdom meant suppressing dissent, protecting landowner authority, and ensuring that the agricultural and industrial machinery of the empire continued to function without interruption. For a woman as well-connected as Olga Briscorn, married to a senator, embedded in the metropolitan elite, moving in circles where her husband's colleagues were the administrators who oversaw the very region where her crimes were being committed, the provincial bureaucracy was less a system of governance and more an additional layer of protection. The factory at Prilapi operated on imported machinery, weaving equipment purchased from abroad, the kind of industrial apparatus that was transforming textile production across Europe. The steam engine that Briscorn installed was, as noted, the first in the central Black Earth economic region. There is a particular irony in the fact that this engine, this symbol of modernity, of progress, of Russia's cautious entry into the industrial age, was the centerpiece of what amounted to a death camp run on feudal principles. The contradiction is not incidental. It is the essential truth of Briscorn's operation. The most modern production technology, driven by the most ancient form of human exploitation, overseen by a woman who attended Sunday services and donated money to the poor. The physical structure of daily life for the serfs in Prilapi existed at the very edge of biological endurance. The 14 to 15-hour working day began before dawn and ended in darkness. The machinery was loud, constant, and unforgiving. The textile production process of the era involved repetitive, physically demanding tasks, operating looms, feeding thread, managing the mechanisms of the steam-powered equipment, work that would exhaust a well-fed, well-rested adult, let alone children of 7 and 8 working without adequate nutrition or sleep. The sleep arrangements, bare straw on the floor of the workshop, meant that workers never properly left the environment of their labor. The noise, the smell of machinery, the physical proximity of the equipment that dominated their waking hours surrounded them even in the intervals between shifts. There was no privacy, no personal space, no psychological boundary between work and whatever small remnant of private existence might otherwise have been possible. The workshop was total. It was everything: the place they worked, the place they slept, the place they suffered, and for many of them, the place they died. The food situation was engineered starvation. The specificity of the recorded rations makes this undeniable. Cabbage soup, a liquid providing minimal caloric content. A spoonful of porridge, insufficient as a primary energy source for even a sedentary person. Piece of bread, variable in quality, almost certainly made from coarse flour of the cheapest grade available. And the wormy meat, 8 grams per person if divided equally, which there is no particular reason to assume it was. The word wormy, in contemporary descriptions, is not metaphorical. It means meat that had already begun to decompose, infested with larvae, technically inedible by any standard of food safety. This was the protein on which Brieskorn expected her workers to operate 14-hour shifts. It was not oversight. It was not the result of poverty or scarcity on the estate. Brieskorn was wealthy. She had access to food resources. The starvation diet was a choice, a financial calculation, or perhaps simply a demonstration of contempt. The consequence of that diet, combined with the brutal workload and the punishing living conditions, was a continuous escalation of illness, physical breakdown, and death. The serfs were not dying from a single epidemic or a sudden catastrophe. They were dying from the cumulative destruction of their bodies, from malnutrition, from untreated injuries sustained in the beatings and in the mechanical accidents that inevitably occur when exhausted, underfed people operate industrial machinery, and from the infectious diseases that spread rapidly through a population sleeping communally on straw floors with no sanitation and compromised immune systems. The beatings themselves deserve particular examination because they were not incidental to the regime, they were its backbone. Whips, bats, and sticks were the instruments recorded in the investigation. These were not weapons of passion. A whip is a deliberate instrument designed specifically for the purpose of inflicting pain, leaving marks, and communicating power. A bat or heavy stick applied to a human body with force breaks bones, ruptures tissue, and causes internal injuries that, without medical treatment, become fatal. The injuries inflicted in the beatings at Prilopi were added on top of bodies that were already compromised by starvation and overwork. Bodies with no reserves, no capacity to heal, no resilience with which to absorb further damage. The children, those 90 workers aged 7 and older, occupied a position of particular vulnerability within this already catastrophically dangerous environment. A 7-year-old's body cannot sustain industrial labor. Full stop. The physical development of a child, that age, the bone density, the muscle mass, the cardiovascular capacity, the caloric requirements relative to output, is simply incompatible with the conditions at Prilopi. The fact that 44 of the dead in the October 1820 to May 1821 period were under the age of 15 tells you everything about what those children's lives looked like. They were being consumed. Their small bodies were being fed into the factory as fuel, ground down by the demands placed on them until they stopped. And when they stopped, they were buried, in a priest's record if they were lucky, in an unmarked pit in the dirt if they were not. The property seizure that accompanied transfer to the factory deserves to be understood as a deliberate act of subjugation rather than simple administrative procedure. When serfs were moved from agricultural work to factory work, Brieskorn confiscated their personal possessions. In the context of serfdom, a serf owned almost nothing, but what little they did own had material significance and psychological weight. A cooking pot, a blanket, tools, small items accumulated over years. These were not luxury goods. They were survival infrastructure and evidence of personhood. Stripping workers of these items on arrival at the factory was a calculated act of humiliation and disempowerment, signaling clearly that in this place, they were no longer even the kind of human being who owned a cooking pot. They were machinery components, and they would be treated accordingly. The doubling of the factory's wage allocation in 1820 is one of the document's grimmer details. On paper, Brieskorn increased the wages paid to her workers. In practice, she then deducted most of the increase for food and clothing, the same starvation rations and presumably the most basic, cheapest garments. The wage increase was a bookkeeping maneuver, a way to appear compliant with standards while continuing to extract maximum labor for minimum human cost. It is the kind of manipulation that requires intelligence to execute. Brieskorn knew what she was doing. She understood the optics of a wage increase, and she understood how to neutralize it. Beyond the factory, life for those who worked Brieskorn's land was barely different from those inside its walls. Agricultural serfs were required to work exclusively on Brieskorn's land, a condition that prevented them from cultivating their own plots and growing food for their own households. The result was identical to what was happening inside the factory: starvation. Not industrial starvation, but the quieter, slower starvation of families watching their small reserves diminish with no prospect of replacement. Children went hungry. Adults went hungry. The dependent relatives of those sent to the factory, the elderly, the very young, those unable to work, were left without support because the people who would have provided it were now either dead, imprisoned in the factory, or among the more than 300 who had fled. Those who fled. This detail deserves its own moment of consideration. More than 300 people ran from Brieskorn's estate during this period. In the legal framework of Russian serfdom, a fleeing serf was a criminal. If captured, and the imperial bureaucracy had mechanisms for hunting and returning runaway serfs, a fugitive faced severe punishment, potentially including flogging, being sent to penal labor, or being pressed into military service. The threat of those consequences was real and well understood. For 300 people to accept that risk, to walk off the estate and into an uncertain future, tells you that the alternative, staying, was so terrifying that legal punishment looked like the better option. 300 separate human decisions, each one a verdict on what Olga Brieskorn had built in Prilopi. The investigative record that eventually emerged described fraudulent operations concerning the factory's products, a detail that adds financial criminality to the tableau of violence. Brieskorn was not simply a brutal overseer. She was also extracting illegal profits from the operation, manipulating the accounting of the factory's output in ways that benefited her personally. This suggests a level of active, engaged administration of the operation. She was not a distant, oblivious owner who failed to notice what her managers were doing. She was present, she was attentive, and she was generating personal financial gain from a system that was simultaneously killing people at a rate of approximately 17 per month. The deaths were not secret within Prilopi. The local priest buried 74 of the dead, 74 individuals whose deaths were formally recorded in ecclesiastical records, whose names were noted, whose burials were witnessed. The priest knew. The local administrators knew. The foremen and overseers who carried out Brieskorn's instructions knew. The other serfs on the estate knew. The 300 who fled carried that knowledge with them when they left. The knowledge of what was happening in Prilopi was not contained. It simply had nowhere to go that would result in action. The system was not designed to respond to the suffering of serfs. It was designed to protect the interests of landowners. And Olga Brieskorn was, by all metropolitan measures, one of the most distinguished landowners in the empire. What is most disturbing about this period from 1818, when the terror began in earnest, to 1822, when the first complaints finally reached the emperor, is not the violence itself, appalling as it was. It is the duration. For years. For years during which the death rate climbed, during which children starved and died and were buried in pits, during which hundreds of people fled in desperation, during which the evidence of ongoing mass murder was available to anyone in the province who cared to look, and no official mechanism activated to stop it. The only action that worked was the decision by local peasants, the serfs themselves or their representatives, to go directly to Emperor Alexander I. To bypass every layer of provincial administration that had already demonstrated its unwillingness to intervene, and appeal directly to the imperial authority at the top of the entire system. That decision required courage that is almost incomprehensible given the context. Serfs petitioning the emperor directly against a senator's widow was an act so socially transgressive that it could easily have been met with punishment for the petitioners rather than investigation of the landowner. The fact that they did it anyway, and that the emperor chose to respond, is the reason this story is documented at all. And even then, even after the emperor himself had been notified, the investigation was not public. It was secret, took 3 years, and its conclusion, as we will see, was not justice in any form that the word usually implies. The most psychologically disturbing dimension of Olga Briskorn's case is not the violence, as extreme as it was. It is the ease. The absolute, seamless, effortless ease with which she occupied 2 entirely contradictory identities simultaneously, each one completely convincing to the people who witnessed it, neither one ever colliding with the other in any way that threatened her security or comfort. In St. Petersburg, she was everything the imperial capital prized in a woman of her class. Educated, articulate, generous, devout, and socially impeccable. The house on Galernaia Street was a gathering point for people of culture and influence. The Pushkin family connection, Alexander Pushkin being not simply a famous poet but a cultural monument, a man whose name was already synonymous with Russian literary greatness, was the ultimate social credential. You do not share your address with Pushkin's family unless you are exactly the kind of person whose company is sought by exactly the kind of people who matter. Olga Briskorn was not on the fringes of respectable Petersburg society. She was at its center. Her piety was not performed hastily or carelessly. She built 3 churches, physical, permanent structures of stone and wood, constructed with her own money, standing in the landscape as evidence of religious devotion. The church she built in the village of Pyataya Gora in 1826 still existed in the modern era, a surviving monument to the woman who commissioned it. She gave alms to the poor. In the moral economy of 19th-century Russian aristocracy, charitable giving and church construction were the primary currencies of spiritual reputation, and Olga Briskorn invested in them heavily. Whatever she was doing in Kursk, her spiritual portfolio in the capital was immaculate. She also gave alms to the poor, real poor people, genuine recipients of charity, individuals whose lives were marginally improved by her donations. The cognitive architecture required to simultaneously starve children to death in a factory 300 miles away and hand coins to beggars on a Petersburg street is not simple sociopathic indifference. It is something more calculated, more compartmentalized, and in its own way more frightening. It suggests not an absence of moral awareness, but an extraordinarily selective application of it. Briskorn was not unaware that starving people were deserving of charity. She gave to them. She simply did not classify the serfs in Prilopi as people in the relevant sense. They were property. Property did not require moral consideration. Property could be used until it broke and then discarded. And the woman who wore pearls to church on Sunday and gave money to the hungry at the cathedral door was still, in her own self-understanding, a good Christian woman. This is not unusual in the historical record of elite violence. What makes the Briskorn case distinctive is the scale, not just of the murders, but of the social distance between her 2 worlds. She was not a rural landowner who rarely left her estates. She was an active, present, visible participant in the most sophisticated social environment in Russia. The contrast between the world of Galernaia Street and the world of Prilopi was not simply geographic. It was civilizational. One was the Russia of Enlightenment ideals, European culture, literary salons, and imperial splendor. The other was the Russia of absolute feudal power, of bodies sleeping on straw, of children dying from 8 grams of rotten meat. Olga Briskorn moved between these worlds without apparent difficulty and without any of the guilt or psychological discomfort that might, in a different person, have shown on her face. Her second husband, Senator Fyodor Maximovich von Briskorn, died before the investigation concluded. The exact date is not recorded with precision, but he had predeceased her by the time the legal consequences materialized. This fact is not trivial. It meant that Olga faced whatever reckoning came without the additional protection of a sitting senator's direct authority. But it also meant that the damage to his reputation, and through him to the reputations of his colleagues and associates in the imperial bureaucracy, was already a factor in how the investigation was handled. Fyodor Briskorn had been a major official, a diplomat, a man whose name meant something in the corridors of Petersburg power. His widow's criminal conduct was therefore not simply the private affair of a provincial landowner. It was a potential scandal that touched the senatorial class itself. The investigation ordered by Emperor Alexander I in 1822 was notably secret. This was not an oversight or a procedural technicality. Secret investigations in the Russian imperial system were specifically designed to gather information without public awareness, which meant that the findings could be controlled, the narrative could be managed, and the outcome could be calibrated to serve the interests of the state rather than those of justice. The 3-year duration of the investigation, from 1822 to approximately 1825, during which the world was not informed of the inquiry, its findings, or its progress, gives some indication of the delicacy with which the matter was being handled at the highest levels. What did the investigation find? The record is specific and damning. The investigators documented the regime of beatings with whips, bats, and sticks. They documented the starvation, the specific rations, the specific mortality figures, the specific ages of the dead children. They documented the seizure of workers' property, the forced holiday labor, the sleeping conditions, the fraudulent financial operations. They documented the mass graves, the 47 workers buried in pits rather than receiving proper burials. They documented the flight of more than 300 serfs. The evidence was comprehensive. The guilt was undeniable. And yet the response, when it finally came, was almost insultingly restrained. By approximately 1825, 3 years after the investigation began and 7 years after the killing had started, Briskorn was stripped of ownership of the Prilapi factory. The factory was placed under state guardianship. Briskorn herself was imprisoned in state custody. Not a common prison, not the kind of harsh institutional confinement that a serf convicted of a crime would have faced, but state custody, which in this context appears to have meant comfortable confinement under supervision rather than punitive incarceration. She was never publicly tried. There was no public proceeding, no public accounting of what had happened in Prilapi, no public verdict that named what she had done and declared it criminal before the society that had admired and hosted her. The 3 churches remained standing. The reputation she had built in Petersburg was not formally demolished. The children in the unmarked pits remained unnamed in the public record. Compare this to the fate of serfs who violated the law. A serf who stole from a landowner could be flogged, sent to Siberia, or drafted into military service. A serf who struck a landowner, even in self-defense, even in response to a beating that was itself illegal under some readings of the law, faced the possibility of execution. The differential in consequences was not simply the product of class bias in individual officials. It was the systematic logic of a society that had built its entire economic and social architecture on the principle that the bodies and lives of serfs were subordinate to the interests of landowners, and that protecting that principle was more important than punishing any individual who had taken it too far. Olga Briskorn lived for 11 more years after the investigation concluded. She died on March 30th, 1836, at the age of approximately 60. By the time she died, the churches she had built were still being used for worship. Her children, 5 of them from 2 marriages, had inherited the vast legacy she and her 2 husbands had accumulated. Homes in St. Petersburg, 52,000 acres of land, 110,000 rubles, and 3,000 serfs. 3,000 living human beings, passed on as a bequest like furniture or livestock, to the children of the woman who had worked 128 of their kind to death. Her daughter Elizaveta Fyodorovna was described by contemporaries as a good and pleasant woman, not particularly beautiful but kind in her dealings with others. Her other daughter, Olga Fyodorovna, married into the adjutant general class and produced 8 children. Her son Pyotr Ananyevich Strukov became a major general and a leading figure in the noble circles of Yekaterinoslav. Her son Emanuel Ananyevich Strukov was a large landowner and military officer. The children of the woman who murdered 128 people flourished. They married well, held high positions, raised families, and were remembered, to the extent they were remembered at all, for their own merits and social standing, not for their mother's crimes. The nickname that history attached to Olga Briskorn, the Kursk Saltychika, is an explicit comparison to Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova, a noblewoman who had murdered approximately 138 of her serfs in the 1760s. Saltykova, nicknamed Saltychika, had been tried publicly, convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment in a convent dungeon, and spent the rest of her long life in genuine confinement. She was publicly disgraced. Her crimes were publicly acknowledged. The system, in that earlier case, had functioned with at least a performance of justice. Briskorn's case was handled differently. By the time of Briskorn's crimes, the Russian state had become even more invested in protecting aristocratic authority, and the impulse to contain rather than expose was stronger. The Saltychika comparison was not flattering. It was an acknowledgement that Briskorn had reached the same moral depths, but the response to her crimes was even more muted, even more protective of the perpetrator, even more dismissive of the victims. What was Olga Briskorn thinking during those 11 years between the investigation's conclusion and her death? Did she consider the 128 bodies, the 44 children, the pits in the ground? Did she regard the confinement she lived under as injustice done to her, an aristocrat of her standing, reduced to state guardianship because of the inconvenient mortality rate of her factory workers? Did the churches comfort her? Did she pray in them? The historical record offers no introspective accounts. No confessions, no letters of remorse, no documentation of her inner life during those final years. She died in 1836 in the Russian Empire, and whatever she carried with her into that death has not been preserved. What was preserved are the records of the investigation. The body counts, the ration allocations, the descriptions of the beatings, the accounting of the pits. Those records exist because the peasants who petitioned the emperor were brave enough to speak, and because the investigative machinery of the Russian state, for all its bias and its protectiveness of aristocratic interests, was meticulous enough to document what it found. The documentation is the memorial. It is the only one the dead of Prilopi have. Justice, in the Briskorn case, is a word that needs to be handled carefully. It is a word that implies proportion, that the consequences delivered match in some meaningful way the magnitude of what was done. By that standard, what Olga Briskorn received was not justice. It was administrative management of a problem that the Russian imperial system found embarrassing. It was the minimum necessary response to prevent the scandal from spreading further than it already had, dressed in the language of legal process and accountability. That it was anything at all is owed entirely to the courage of the peasants who bypassed the provincial bureaucracy and spoke directly to the emperor, and to whatever impulse moved Alexander I to order a genuine investigation rather than simply having the petition dismissed and the petitioners punished. The petition itself, that act of collective, desperate bravery, deserves to be held up against the backdrop of everything that preceded it. Consider what it meant for serfs in 1822 Russia to formally address the emperor about the conduct of a senator's widow. The social order of the Russian Empire was not a system in which such things were done casually or without understanding of the risks involved. Serfs who complained about their landowners through official channels were routinely accused of insubordination, their complaints dismissed, and themselves punished. The entire provincial bureaucracy was predisposed to side with the landowner, for the obvious reasons of class loyalty and the structural dependence of local officials on the goodwill of the nobility. The local administrators in Kursk Governorate had been aware, to some degree, of what was happening in Prilopi. The priests' burial records alone were sufficient evidence, and had done nothing. The decision to go directly to the emperor, bypassing every layer of administration that had already demonstrated its indifference, was therefore not just a legal maneuver. It was an act of resistance. It was the recognition that every available channel below the very top of the system had been corrupted or intimidated into silence, and that the only remaining option was to reach for the apex of imperial authority itself. The peasants who made that decision. Their names are not prominently preserved in the historical record, another of this story's telling silences, were gambling their own safety on the possibility that the emperor was different from the rest of the system, that he might actually respond. He did. The 3-year secret investigation that followed was genuine in its findings, if restrained in its conclusions. The investigators went to Kursk. They examined the factory. They interviewed witnesses. They reviewed the priests' burial records. They counted the bodies. They documented the rations, the working conditions, the beatings, the mass graves. They were meticulous. The record they produced was detailed enough to survive into the modern historical record with specific numbers, specific dates, specific descriptions. They did their job. The limitation was in what the investigation was permitted or chose to recommend. Removing Brieskorn from ownership of the factory and placing it under state guardianship was a financial consequence, not a criminal one. It deprived her of the income stream and the arena of her crimes, but it did not publicly name what she had done as murder. It did not impose the kind of public shame and formal legal condemnation that would have communicated to Russian aristocratic society that this level of brutality towards serfs crossed a line that the state would not tolerate. It did not provide any formal acknowledgement that the 128 people who died in Prilipy had been wronged in a way that deserved legal remedy. The state custody in which Brieskorn was confined must also be examined for what it was and was not. Russian penal history of this era included options ranging from the genuinely horrific Siberian exile, hard labor camps, military service in dangerous postings, to the relatively comfortable, for those whose social standing made harsher treatment politically inconvenient. There is no record of Brieskorn being subjected to conditions that resembled, even distantly, the conditions she had imposed on her workers. The confinement she experienced was almost certainly administrative rather than punitive. A removal from active management of her affairs rather than an experience of deprivation, suffering, or degradation. She was not sleeping on straw. She was not being beaten with whips. She was not receiving 8 grams of wormy meat as her daily protein allocation. She was comfortable, and she died comfortable in 1836, at approximately 60 years of age. This is a natural lifespan for the era, not shortened by her punishment, not accelerated by her confinement. She lived out her years in whatever manner state guardianship permitted, and she died at the age that a woman of her health and social standing could reasonably expect to die. The children in the pits were between 7 and 15 years old. The comparison is uncomfortable to write and necessary to include. It is the moral core of this story. The people who died in Prilipy were children and adults who had committed no crime, who were held in their positions by the legal architecture of serfdom, who had no power to resist and no official avenue of protection, and who died from the deliberate, calculated, systematically maintained conditions that Olga Brieskorn designed and enforced. The person responsible for their deaths lived another decade after the investigation concluded, died in her bed, and left her children an estate of 52,000 acres, 110,000 rubles, and 3,000 human beings. The legacy of the Brieskorn case exists in several layers. The most immediate is the historical record itself, the investigative documents, the Wikipedia entries compiled from archival sources, the burial records, the census data from the factory investigation. These form the documentary proof that this happened, that it was investigated, that the findings were recorded. The existence of this record is not something that can be taken for granted. Far more crimes committed against serfs in the Russian Empire were never documented at all, were absorbed into the silence of a system that had no mechanism for preserving the accounts of the powerless. The Brieskorn case survived partly because of its scale. 128 documented dead is a figure large enough to force administrative attention, partly because of the petition to the emperor, and partly because of the thoroughness of the investigators who conducted the inquiry. The second layer of legacy is the comparison to Saltychika, to Daria Saltykova, whose crimes in the 1760s had become the defining benchmark for aristocratic violence against serfs. The nickname Kursk Saltychika, attached to Brieskorn, was not simply a regional label. It was a moral classification, a statement that she had entered the same category of perpetrator as the woman whose name had become a byword for the darkest extremes of serf-owner brutality. Brieskorn was not the only woman compared to Saltychika. Historical research has identified several others from the same era. Princess Anna Stepanovna Sheleshpanskaya, who killed 15 serfs in a drunken rage and earned the label Chakloma Saltychika. Princess Alexandra Vladimirovna Kozalovskaya, who tortured and maimed Honorata Statskaya, the Saltychika from Moser Uezd, who allegedly surpassed all of them and was exiled to Siberia. The pattern suggests that the Saltychika comparisons were not metaphorical. There was a genuine category of aristocratic female perpetrators who used their unchecked authority over serfs to commit acts of systematic, lethal violence, and who were enabled by the same structural conditions: serfdom, aristocratic privilege, provincial administrative corruption, and the profound disinclination of the Russian state to publicly condemn its own nobility. The third layer of legacy is architectural. The church that Briskorn built in Pyataya Gora in 1826, constructed while the investigation into her crimes was either still ongoing or very recently concluded, was reportedly still standing in the modern era. A building funded by the woman who killed 128 people, still serving as a place of worship. This is not uncommon in the history of wealthy criminals who also donated to religion and culture. The impulse to commemorate the generous patron and forget the brutal overseer is deeply human, deeply institutional, and deeply difficult to resist when the physical evidence of generosity is a beautiful stone building that communities come to love over 2 centuries. But the church in Pyataya Gora is also a monument to the specific perversity of Briskorn's double life. Built at her personal expense, in a village near one of her estates, during the years when her factory was being stripped from her as a consequence of her crimes. The piety was structural. It outlasted the scandal. It has been, for most of the time since her death, the more visible part of her legacy. The fourth and perhaps most morally significant layer of legacy is what the Briskorn case reveals about the limits of legal protection under a system of institutionalized human bondage. The serfs of Prilopi were not legally recognized as having been murdered, because the legal system of the Russian Empire did not, in practice, treat the killing of serfs by landowners as equivalent to murder in the criminal sense. The investigation documented deaths. It did not charge Briskorn with homicide. It charged her, in effect, with mismanagement, with running her operation in a way that was wasteful of human resources to the point of official embarrassment. The framing matters. The legal category in which the deaths were placed determined the severity of the response, and the response was calibrated to protect the social order rather than honor the dead. Serfdom itself was abolished in Russia in 1861, 25 years after Briskorn's death, 39 years after the petition to the emperor. The abolition came too late for every person who died in Prilopi. It came too late for the children under 15 buried in 1820 and 1821. It came too late for the 300 who fled and faced the consequences of their flight. But it came, and part of what drove the abolitionist movement in Russia, part of what made the argument for emancipation increasingly difficult for the imperial government to ignore, was the accumulation of documented horror cases exactly like the one at Prilopi. The Briskorn investigation, the Saltychika case, the documented brutalities of other serf owners. These cases entered the historical consciousness of educated Russians as evidence that the system itself was morally intolerable, that its logical endpoint was always the Prilopi factory floor, and that a society that produced and protected women like Olga Briskorn was a society in need of fundamental structural change. Briskorn's story is, in this sense, part of the history of Russian emancipation, not as a hero or a catalyst, but as an exhibit. A documented, investigated, numbered exhibit in the case against the system that enabled her. The 128 dead of Prilopi deserve to be remembered not as a statistic, but as the specific consequence of specific choices made by a specific woman over several specific years. They deserve the same acknowledgement that the historical record gives to the buildings she funded and the social circles she graced. They were real. The children especially were real. Small people with ages, with families, with whatever small interior lives 7 and 8 and 12-year-olds have, brought to a factory in Kursk Governorate and worked until they could not continue. Their names are mostly not preserved. The investigative record gives numbers, not names, which is its own comment on how the system valued their existence. But they were people. And the woman who killed them was photographed, metaphorically, at literary salons in St. Petersburg, presiding over candlelit dinners, handing coins to the poor at cathedral steps, and being remembered, in at least some circles, for the churches she built. The Kursk Saltychika died in 1836. The factories she funded outlasted her. The churches she built outlasted her. The unmarked pits in the Kursk earth outlasted her. And now, nearly 2 centuries later, the story itself has outlasted the silence that was meant to contain it, brought forward by the archival work of historians, the persistence of the investigative record, and the courage of the peasants who, in 1822, decided that the emperor needed to know what was happening in Prilopi. He did, and now so do you. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Death to Beauties. The blood-soaked legend of Nikolai Radkevich aka Vadim the Bloodsucker, Russia's first serial monster. He did not stalk the dark alleys of London. He did not wear a top hat or leave cryptic letters soaked in mockery. He walked the gaslit boulevards of St. Petersburg in a long black coat, his arms hanging unnaturally long at his sides, a skipper's beard framing a face that concealed something so deeply rotten that even the psychiatrists who later studied him could not agree on what species of evil they were truly dealing with. Picture this. It is the summer of 1909. Russia is a nation already trembling. Revolution is a word whispered behind closed doors, and the empire of the Tsar is beginning to crack at its magnificent golden edges. The streets of St. Petersburg gleam with the contradiction of a city that is both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. Gas lamps flicker along Ligovsky Avenue. The Neva River rolls dark and silent beneath stone bridges. Somewhere in those shadows, a young man who had once worn a military cadet's uniform, a boy who had once had a future, a name, a path, has made a decision so terrifying in its calm deliberateness that it will freeze detectives in their tracks. He has decided that it is his sacred duty, his life's mission, his calling from whatever god he privately worshipped, to cleanse the world of women he considered depraved. He has already chosen his first victim. He has already purchased the knife. He walks toward her with complete composure, his long arms swinging steadily, his face betraying nothing. And somewhere behind him, scratched onto the wall of his lodgings in handwriting that will later make investigators go cold, are three words that define everything: death to beauties. Welcome to the case that turned St. Petersburg's underworld upside down, baffled its finest detectives, and introduced Russia to something it had not yet had a name for. A serial killer with a philosophy, a mission, and an alias that still sends a chill through any room it is spoken in. This is the story of Nikolai Vladimirovich Radkevich, known to the terrified working women of St. Petersburg as Vadim the Bloodsucker. And nothing you have heard before has prepared you for what actually happened. There are moments in history that feel so perfectly, horrifyingly constructed that one might be forgiven for wondering whether fate itself plays a role in manufacturing monsters. The early life of Nikolai Vladimirovich Radkevich reads like precisely such a construction. A sequence of events so psychologically explosive in their consequence that those who later examined his case found themselves pulled between revulsion and a grim, reluctant understanding of how one human being can transform so completely into something else entirely. Radkevich was born in approximately 1888 within the Russian Empire, though the exact location and precise date of his birth have never been confirmed. What is known with certainty is where he ended up as a young boy: the Arakchev Cadet Corps in Nizhny Novgorod. The Arakchev Cadet Corps was a military school, the kind of institution that shaped young Russian men into soldiers and officers, instilling in them discipline, hierarchy, and the weight of duty to the empire. Boys who entered those walls were expected to emerge as something formidable. They learned formation and order. They learned how to carry themselves. They were being forged, in the deliberate and often brutal tradition of Russian military education, into instruments of the state. Young Nikolai would have been no different from his peers at first glance. A boy among boys, subject to the rigors of cadet life, wearing the uniform with the particular pride that military cadets of the Russian Empire were trained to carry. He was still a child in many of the ways that matter most. 14 years old, not yet a man, still pliable, still capable of being shaped either toward greatness or toward ruin. What happened next determined everything. By his own account, given many years later when there was no longer any reason to invent fiction, a woman approximately 30 years of age entered his life and seduced him. She was considerably older. He was 14. What passed between them? The nature of the relationship, its duration, the precise mechanics of how a woman of 30 positioned herself so close to a military cadet still a child in the eyes of any reasonable measure, is not documented in detail. But the outcome is, the woman abandoned him, and she did not leave cleanly. She left him with syphilis. Let that land for a moment. A 14-year-old boy, already navigating the harsh environment of a military academy, discovers that the woman who seduced and then discarded him has also infected him with one of the most stigmatized, physically devastating, and emotionally annihilating diseases of the era. Syphilis in 1902 in the Russian Empire was not merely a medical condition. It carried profound social shame. It marked a person, It traveled through the body in stages, and without the treatments that would only emerge decades later, it was a sentence. Not immediately a death sentence, but a sentence of suffering, of secrecy, of damage that accumulated over years. For a 14-year-old boy in a military school, the discovery must have been catastrophic in every dimension at once. Physical, social, psychological, existential. Radkevich did not turn inward and collapse quietly. He turned outward and exploded. His rage became immediate and violent. He attempted to kill the woman who had infected him. He went after her with whatever he had in him. This boy, this child, this cadet, and he tried to end her life. He failed. The woman's new lover intervened, physically overpowering Radkevich and delivering him to the nearest police station. The scandal that erupted in the aftermath was, by any measure, devastating. The military institution had no tolerance for this kind of disorder. No tolerance for the exposure of what had happened, no tolerance for the violence that the boy had attempted, no tolerance for the entire ugly tangle of it. Radkevich was expelled from the Arakchev Cadet Corps. Consider what that expulsion meant. His future, the structured, purposeful, uniformed future that the military school represented, was gone. The community that had surrounded him was gone. The identity that came with the uniform, the rank, the formation, gone. He left those walls stripped of everything the institution had given him and carrying everything the woman had left inside him. The infection, the rage, the humiliation, the burning sense of betrayal. He was still essentially a boy. He had nowhere to go that made sense. And something inside him, some essential mechanism that might have bent him toward a different kind of life, had snapped cleanly in two. What followed in the years between his expulsion and 1909 is largely obscured by the incomplete historical record. He eventually became a sailor, a life that suited a man who wished to move without being tracked, who wished to appear and disappear between cities as ship schedules demanded, who wished to carry no permanent address and no permanent accountability. As a sailor, Radkevich was mobile. He passed through ports. He arrived and departed without the kind of fixity that makes a person visible to investigators. It was a life built, whether consciously or not, for a man who was quietly incubating something terrible. He called himself Vadim Krovyanik among his casual acquaintances. The name meant nothing immediately alarming to those around him. Krovyanik was simply a name, a persona, a face he presented to the world that was not quite his own. But the word Krov in Russian carries a root connected to blood. Whether this was deliberate on his part, a dark joke embedded in the alias he wore, is something the historical record does not confirm. What is confirmed is that the name stuck, that it would later become the alias by which he was feared, and that investigators would find themselves chasing a ghost named Vadim for weeks before they understood who they were actually looking for. By 1909, Radkevich had crystallized something within himself into a kind of ideology. He had decided, and this is documented in what he later said, in the notes he left behind, in the words scratched onto the wall of his lodgings, that the defining purpose of his life was to cleanse the world of women he considered immoral. The word he used was not merely descriptive. It was theological in its register. Purification. He had transformed his personal wound, the seduction at 14, the infection, the abandonment, the expulsion, into a mission statement. He was not simply angry. He was righteous in the most grotesque sense of that word. He believed, with apparent sincerity, that what he was doing was not crime but calling. St. Petersburg in 1909 was a city of extraordinary contrasts. The grandeur of the imperial capital, its canals, its palaces, its broad boulevards, sat alongside the grinding poverty and social desperation of a population that the Tsar's government was rapidly failing. Prostitution existed on a scale that the authorities managed through a system of official registration. Women engaged in the trade were required to carry a yellow identity document, the so-called yellow ticket, which marked them officially as registered sex workers. The system was simultaneously a mechanism of control and a mark of social stigma, and the women who carried those yellow tickets moved through the city in a state of legal visibility that made them, paradoxically, vulnerable. They were known. They were documented. They were trackable. And to a man like Radkevich, who had constructed an entire ideology around his contempt for such women, they were targets. He arrived in St. Petersburg with his knife and his mission and his alias, and the city, glittering and enormous and preoccupied with the tremors of an empire under pressure, had no idea what was walking through its streets. He had chosen his first victim. He had already, in the quiet architecture of his own disturbed mind, written her death warrant. Her name was Anna Blumentrost. She was 20 years old. She carried the yellow ticket. She had no idea that the tall man in the long black coat with the skipper's beard and the disproportionately long arms who was watching her from the shadows of St. Petersburg's summer streets had decided that she was going to die. The summer of 1909 was about to become something that St. Petersburg citizens would speak of in lowered voices for years to come. The bloodsucker was ready, the knife was sharp, and the city had not yet learned to be afraid. What Radkevich did next, the method he employed, the coldness with which he executed it, and the horrifying evidence he left behind, would pull investigators from their offices and press the faces of St. Petersburg's working women against the glass of their own terror. A monster was not lurking in the darkness. He was walking in the light, calm and purposeful, and nobody had yet thought to look at him. The summer nights along the Neva were long and pale with the white light peculiar to St. Petersburg's famous white night season, when the sky never quite surrenders to darkness. It should have been a summer of beauty, of long evenings and the gentle sound of water against stone. Instead, it was about to become a season of blades and bruises and dark water swallowing secrets. Anna Blumentrost's final hours unfolded in that pale summer light. She had no reason to treat this encounter differently from any other. She was a young woman navigating a dangerous world with the tools available to her. She met a man. She went with him. She could not have known. No one could have known that Radkevich had not come to negotiate terms. He had come to deliver what he considered a verdict. The knife came out, and what followed was not rage in the way most people understand that word. Not an explosion, not a loss of control. What followed was something more disturbing than uncontrolled fury. It was controlled fury, directed, sustained. He stabbed Anna Blumentrost 12 times. 12 deliberate wounds to her face, her neck, and her shoulders. Then he carried her body to the bank of the Neva River and dropped her in. The dark water accepted her without ceremony. She sank below the surface of the city's most famous waterway and disappeared. Radkevich walked away. He straightened his long coat. He was, in his own mind, not a murderer. He was a cleaner, and the city of St. Petersburg, utterly oblivious, went on around him with its carriages and its gas lamps and its whispered politics and its imperial grandeur. The summer was not even halfway through, and Vadim the bloodsucker was not even close to finished. July 1st, 1909 began like most summer mornings along the Neva River, with the particular quiet of water and stone and the muted sounds of a city stirring itself awake. A passerby moving along the Kalashnikovsky bank of the river saw something in the water. They looked closer, as people do when something breaks the expected pattern of a morning scene. What they found broke more than the pattern of that morning. It broke something in the city that would not fully repair itself until September. The body of Anna Blumentrost was pulled from the river and identified through the yellow ticket she had carried, the official document that had marked her as a registered sex worker in the Russian Empire's system of regulated prostitution. She was 20 years old. She had sustained more than 12 stab wounds concentrated on her face, neck, and shoulders. The violence that had been done to her was not random or frenzied in the way that a sudden, momentary loss of control might produce. This was repeated, sustained. The knife had struck again and again and again with a focus that told investigators, even at this early stage, that whoever had done this had not panicked during the act. Whoever had done this had remained present, deliberate, and methodical through every single blow. The investigation began immediately under the personal leadership of Vladimir Filipov, the head of the St. Petersburg Detective Police. Filipov was experienced and thorough, and he understood from the evidence before him that this was not an ordinary case. The nature of the wounds, the calculated disposal of the body in the river, the selection of the victim, all of it pointed toward a perpetrator who had thought about this before doing it. This was premeditated. This was organized. This was the work of someone who intended to do it again. The first round of questioning among the working women of St. Petersburg's red light district produced some useful leads. Before her disappearance, Anna Blumentrost had been seen with a man whose description would prove critical to the investigation. He was tall. He wore a long black coat and a large hat, the kind of clothing that created shadow around a face even in St. Petersburg's pale summer light. He had a skipper's beard, the full nautical style associated with seafaring men. And his arms, several witnesses noted independently of one another, were disproportionately long, hanging at his sides with the peculiar reach of a man whose limbs seemed to extend slightly further than expected. This detail, the arms, was unusual enough that investigators logged it with particular care. It was the kind of specific physical characteristic that does not get invented by witnesses. People notice what surprises them. The long arms had surprised people. The city's working women began to panic. Word moved quickly through the networks of women who shared the streets, the brothels, the hotels of St. Petersburg's underworld. Something was out there. Something wearing a long coat and a skipper's beard, with arms that reached too far and a knife that had already found one throat in the summer dark. The yellow ticket community of St. Petersburg was a community under threat, and they knew it before the newspapers had finished printing the story. Radkevich gave them almost exactly 2 weeks before he demonstrated that their fear was entirely warranted. On the 14th of July, 1909, he selected his second victim. Her name was Ekaterina Jaros. She was a prostitute whom Radkevich encountered near Vostania Square, one of St. Petersburg's significant landmarks, an open public space that in 1909 sat surrounded by the architecture of a city still proudly imperial. He approached her with the same composure that would characterize every interaction he ever had with his targets. He spoke to her. He negotiated with her. He presented himself as a client, as a man with ordinary intentions and a hotel room in mind. This was his method, not the sudden ambush in a dark alley, not the attack from behind in an empty street. He made arrangements. He brought his victims inside, into rooms, into spaces where privacy was assumed and screaming would be muffled by walls. He brought Ekaterina Jaros to the Hotel Danube, the Dunai, on Legovsky Avenue, a street long and straight and lined with the kind of mid-tier establishments that serviced both travelers and the city's underground economy. He booked room 9 on the 3rd floor. This was deliberate. 3rd floor, specific room. He had thought about which room. He had thought about what he was going to do in it. Ekaterina Jaros walked through that door having no idea that she was walking into something from which she would not emerge alive. What happened in room 9 of the Hotel Danube on the night of July 14th was reconstructed later by investigators from the physical evidence left behind. Radkevich stabbed Ekaterina Jaros at least 20 times. 20 times. Not 12, as he had stabbed Anna Blumentrost, but 20, as if the act were expanding with each repetition, as if whatever compulsion drove the knife demanded more expression each time it was allowed to speak. But the stab wounds, multiple and savage as they were, did not kill her. He strangled her instead, his hands around her throat, his disproportionately long arms giving him the reach and leverage that his witnesses had noted about him. He held the strangulation until she was gone. Then he laid her down. He left the room. The following morning at 8 a.m., he descended from room 9, spoke briefly to the bellhop at the desk, and told the man to wake the woman in his room in about an hour. He said this calmly. He said it the way a man says it when he has simply had a pleasant evening and wants the woman he spent it with to sleep a little longer. The bellhop had no reason to suspect anything. Radkevich walked out of the Hotel Danube into the summer morning of St. Petersburg and disappeared back into the city's anonymous mass of faces. 1 hour later, the bellhop went to room 9. What he found there would haunt the staff of the Hotel Danube in a way that closed establishments and ended careers. Ekaterina Jaros lay where she had been left, stabbed more than 20 times, strangled, and discarded with the calm purposefulness of a man who considered what he had done not a crime but a completion. Investigators now had 2 murders. Both victims were women from the same profession. Both killings bore the same signature. Multiple stab wounds combined with strangulation, executed in a context of apparent voluntary encounter, followed by calm departure. Vladimir Filipov's team reached the conclusion that a single perpetrator was responsible for both deaths. They did not yet have a name. They did not yet have a face beyond the witness descriptions. Tall, long coat, skipper's beard, those arms. But they had a pattern, and patterns are the first language of criminal investigation. The pattern also told them something more disturbing than the number of victims. It told them that this man was not stopping. He was not a man who had committed a crime of passion and retreated in horror at what he had done. He was a man who had committed 2 murders in 2 weeks and felt, apparently, entirely comfortable doing so. He had not fled the city. He had not changed his appearance. He had not altered his method in any way that suggested doubt or fear. He had simply moved on to the next phase of whatever internal schedule he was running on. 10 days after the discovery of Ekaterina Jaros's body, on July 24th, Radkevich attempted his next attack, but this time something disrupted the plan. He encountered a maid named Zinaida Levin and came at her with his knife, shouting as he struck, and the words he chose in that moment were the same 3 words that he had scratched onto the wall of his lodgings: "Death to beauties." He screamed it at Zinaida Levin as the blade moved, but random passers-by appeared before he could complete what he had started. Their presence was enough. Radkevich broke off the attack and ran. Zinaida Levin survived. She was wounded but alive, and she had heard the words he screamed, and she was a witness. The very next day, July 25th, he attempted another attack on a prostitute in a brothel on Kolomenskia Street. This also failed. Something, perhaps another interruption, perhaps a moment in which the circumstances didn't align to his satisfaction, caused him to abandon the attempt before it reached its conclusion. 2 failed attacks in 2 consecutive days suggested a man whose compulsion was accelerating faster than his opportunities, a predator circling with increasing urgency. The investigation deepened. Investigators began working through the networks of men who matched the physical description. Tall, long-armed, nautically bearded, and who had been present in St. Petersburg during the critical dates. The killer had been calling himself Vadim Krovyanik to his casual acquaintances, and this name was not immediately connected to any known individual. It was a fictitious identity, a performance name worn over the real one like a second skin. For a while, the investigation chased Vadim Krovyanik as if he were a real person with a real history and a real paper trail, and found nothing. The breakthrough came through the ship logs. Investigators began cross-referencing physical descriptions and presence dates with maritime records, the documented movements of sailors who had been in port during the windows when the attacks occurred. The records of ships berthed at St. Petersburg during June and July 1909 were pulled and examined. And there, fitting the physical descriptions with uncanny precision, tall, distinctive arms, the beard, the general profile, was the name of a real sailor, not Vadim Krovyanik, Nikolai Radkevich. When police moved to his lodgings, they found him already gone. But the lodgings themselves were revelatory. Scratched onto the wall, as if placed there as both declaration and warning, were the same words Zinaida Levin had heard screamed at her as the knife descended: "Death to beauties." This was not a random phrase. This was a manifesto in 3 words. This was Radkevich's stated position on the women he was hunting. Not rage, not compulsion presented as regret, but a commitment written into the wall of his home for anyone entering to see. He had wanted those words visible. He had put them there on purpose. The police were close. He could feel it. And yet, he did not leave the city. He did not board a ship and disappear into the anonymity of the open sea. He waited. He composed himself. And on September 19th, nearly 2 months after his last completed murder, Nikolai Radkevich was ready to kill again. There is something almost incomprehensible about the psychological state of a man who knows the police are searching for him, who knows that witnesses have seen him, whose physical description has been circulated through the city's investigative apparatus, and who still, calmly, deliberately, without apparent anxiety, makes arrangements for his next murder. It speaks not to recklessness but to something deeper and more disturbing, a conviction so absolute that it overrides every instinct of self-preservation. Radkevich did not feel hunted in the way that most criminals feel hunted. He felt called, And a man who believes he is executing a calling does not run from the people trying to stop him. He simply continues. September 19th, 1909. The summer had ended. St. Petersburg was moving into the cooler, grayer light of early autumn, the Neva beginning its seasonal shift toward the kind of darkness that the white nights had briefly suspended. 2.5 months had passed since the murder of Ekaterina Jairus in room 9 of the Hotel Danube. The city's women were still afraid. The investigation was still active. Vladimir Filipov's detective police were still working the case, still cross-referencing sailors' names against physical profiles, still trying to find a man whose alias was a blood word and whose walls spoke of death to beauties. Radkevich selected his third victim. Her name was Maria Buduknikova. She was a prostitute working St. Petersburg's trade, and she encountered Radkevich on the 19th of September with no knowledge of who he was, no access to the ship logs and witness descriptions that might have made her walk away from him. She saw what he chose to show her: a potential client, a man with money for a hotel room, a transaction that would play out according to the familiar rhythm of her working life. He brought her to the Hotel Kio, a different hotel from the Danube. The same method, same calculation, same privacy of a room with walls thick enough to absorb what was coming. He secured a room. He brought her inside. He closed the door. What he did to Maria Buduknikova exceeded everything he had done before. The escalation that investigators had noted in the jump from 12 wounds on Anna Blumentrost to 20 or more on Ekaterina Jairus now extended itself further. Radkevich inflicted 35 stab wounds on Maria Buduknikova. 35. The knife entered her body 35 times. Face, neck, chest, shoulders. A sustained assault of a duration and deliberateness that the subsequent examination of the crime scene made viscerally, devastatingly clear. He also strangled her as he had strangled Jairus. And then, when she was dead and the room was red and silent, he did something that no investigator could have fully anticipated. He robbed her. He went through her belongings and took her money. And then he sat down and wrote a note. Not a hasty scrawl, not a panicked scribble. A composed, signed communication that he left on the bed beside her body. The note read, in its essential content, as follows. The money was taken because dead women have no need of it, as payment for the service of sending her to the next world. And then he signed it. He signed the note with a name, not Nikolai Radkevich, the name in the ship logs, the name on the maritime records, but Vadim Krovyanik. He referred specifically in the note to the murder of Ekaterina Jairus at the Hotel Danube. He connected the two killings by name and signature. He claimed both murders. He was, in some sense of the word that defies easy categorization, proud of what he had done. This is the moment in the case that most clearly illuminates the particular shape of Radkevich's psychology. He was not trying to escape detection by the time he wrote that note. He was not writing it in spite of the risk it posed. He was writing it because the risk was irrelevant to him. What mattered was the declaration. What mattered was that whoever found Maria Buduknikova's body would know that Vadim Krovyanik had been here, had done this, and considered it justified. The note was an act of ideological ownership. He was signing his work the way an artist signs a canvas, except the canvas was a murdered woman and the signature was written in the arrogant certainty of a man who believed that what he had done was not a crime but a corrective. He then left the room. But this time, the usual clean departure did not unfold as planned. The bellhop at the Hotel Kio was a man who had, presumably, heard about the murders at the Hotel Danube. St. Petersburg in September 1909 was not a city living in ignorance of the danger moving through its hotel corridors. The working women were afraid. The hotel staff were aware. And this particular bellhop, alert and observant, noticed something through the keyhole of the room that Radkevich had just exited. He saw enough to understand that the room's occupant was not sleeping. He made a noise, a small, alarmed sound, the instinctive vocalization of a person confronted with the unthinkable. Radkevich heard it. He had not yet left the corridor. He turned back and attacked the bellhop with his knife, striking him with the same weapon that had just been driven 35 times into Maria Buduknikova's body. But the bellhop's noise had been enough. Other hotel employees had been close enough to hear it, close enough to respond before Radkevich could escape. They arrived in the corridor. They physically overpowered him. They restrained him until the police arrived. It was September 17th, 1909. Nikolai Vladimirovich Radkevich, Vadim the Bloodsucker, the man who had scratched death threats onto the walls of his own lodgings and left signed notes beside his victims, was in custody. The knife was with him. The evidence was overwhelming. He was 21 years old, and the city of St. Petersburg had its answer to the question that had consumed the summer. The confession that followed was not a sudden unburdening or a tortured admission wrung from a broken man. Radkevich explained himself. He explained the woman at the military academy, the infection, the expulsion, the rage that had not subsided in the years between that expulsion and the summer of 1909, but had instead been refined into something he experienced as purpose. He told investigators about the decision he had made, the vocation, as he understood it, of purifying the world of depraved women. He used that word deliberately, purification, the language of righteousness applied to the act of stabbing women to death in hotel rooms was not a performance of madness. The psychiatrists who examined him would debate whether this constituted madness at all, and their disagreement was itself one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. The investigation under Vladimir Filipov now moved to close every open thread. The ship logs confirmed Radkevich's presence in St. Petersburg during every attack date. The physical description provided by witnesses matched him precisely. The alias Vadim Krovyanik was traced back to him through his acquaintances. The note left at the Hotel Kio was in his handwriting. And the knife, still bearing the residue of September 19th's work, was the final physical link in a chain that needed no further reinforcement. St. Petersburg's women breathed. Not easily, nothing about what had happened permitted easy breathing, but they breathed. The tall man with the long coat and the skipper's beard and the arms that reached too far had a name now, had handcuffs, had a cell. The streets around Legovsky Avenue and Vostania Square and Kolomenskia Street were no longer patrolled by a ghost. The ghost had been caught. And what would happen to it next was a question for courts and psychiatrists and the grinding machinery of Imperial Russian justice. What would not be resolved so easily was the question of what Radkevich actually was. The debate that erupted among the physicians and psychiatrists assigned to evaluate him was not a simple disagreement about paperwork or procedural categorization. It was a fundamental argument about human nature. Some of the psychiatrists concluded that Radkevich was a sadist, fully cognizant of what he was doing, fully in command of his faculties, morally responsible for every wound he had inflicted. Others argued that he was a degenerate in the clinical sense then used by European medicine, a person with congenital defects of character and psychology, captured by a false sense of righteousness so total and so consuming that it amounted to a form of moral insanity. Both positions were defensible from the evidence. Both positions were disturbing in different ways. If he was a sadist with full responsibility, then what he had done was pure evil performed by a reasoning person. If he was a degenerate driven by false righteousness, then what he had done was the inevitable product of a broken instrument that had no genuine capacity for the judgment it believed itself to be exercising. Neither conclusion offered comfort. Both conclusions kept Russia's legal and medical establishments awake at night, arguing. And Radkevich sat in the psychiatric hospital of St. Nicholas the Wonderworker on the bank of the Pryaska River and waited for the world to decide what to do with him. On March 10, 1912, more than 2.5 years after his arrest outside the Hotel Kio, Nikolai Vladimirovich Radkevich stood before a jury trial in St. Petersburg and faced formal judgment for what he had done in the summer of 1909. The time between his arrest and his trial had been consumed by the extensive and inconclusive psychiatric evaluations, the procedural machinery of Imperial Russian justice, and the genuine difficulty of categorizing a man whose crimes were clear and whose psychology remained contested. The trial itself drew attention. Cases of this nature, the serial nature of the killings, the ideological framework the killer had articulated, the signed note left beside a victim's body, the alias, the military background, the psychiatrist's disagreement were not common in Russian legal history. Russia had its violence. Russia had its crimes of passion, and its poverty-driven desperation, and its political assassinations, and its criminal underworlds of impressive organization. But this was something else. This was, in the language that would be standardized decades later in American criminology, a serial killer with a typology and a self-constructed justification. Russia in 1912 had no such framework readily available. The courts had to work with what they had: the evidence of 3 murders, the testimony, the psychiatric reports, and the laws of the Russian Empire. The jury found Radkevich guilty. The sentence handed down was 8 years in the katorga. The katorga, a word that most Western audiences recognize from the literature of Dostoevsky and the history of Siberian exile, was not a conventional prison sentence. It was a sentence of penal servitude in the most physical and brutal sense possible. Convicted criminals sentenced to katorga were transported east, away from the civilized cities of European Russia, away from St. Petersburg and Moscow and the rest of the empire's inhabited west, and into the vastness of Siberia. There, they performed forced labor under conditions that the word harsh is structurally inadequate to describe. The cold of Siberian winters was not incidental to the katorga experience. It was part of the punishment. The isolation was deliberate. The labor was backbreaking. The environment was designed to extract suffering from the people assigned to it. For a man who had spent the summer of 1909 walking the gaslit boulevards of St. Petersburg in a long black coat, staying in hotels and leaving notes beside his victims, the katorga represented a total destruction of the world he had operated in. No more hotel corridors. No more ships docking in port cities. No more knife in the coat pocket and a plan for the evening. Siberia and forced labor and walls of ice and fellow prisoners who had their own histories of violence and their own hierarchies and their own reckonings to perform. Radkevich was 21 when he was arrested. He was approximately 24 when he arrived in the katorga. He had 8 years of this ahead of him if he survived it. He did not survive it. Not 8 years. Not close to 8 years. The historical record notes that in the autumn of 1916, approximately 4 years into his sentence, when he was approximately 27 or 28 years old, Nikolai Vladimirovich Radkevich was killed by his fellow inmates. The specific circumstances of this killing are not documented in detail in the available historical sources. The katorga was not an environment that maintained meticulous records of prisoner-on-prisoner violence. What is recorded is the outcome. He died. He was murdered. The man who had gone to Siberia after murdering women in St. Petersburg hotel rooms did not die of exposure or disease or the grinding attrition of forced labor. He was killed by people who shared his imprisonment. There is a particular terrible irony embedded in this ending that the most somber reading of the case cannot entirely escape. Radkevich had built an entire ideology around the idea that certain human beings deserved to be removed from the world for moral failures he had appointed himself to judge. He had executed that ideology with a knife in hotel rooms, leaving notes that proclaimed his actions just. He ended his own life as the target of exactly the kind of judgment he had imposed on others, found insufficient by the people around him, and eliminated accordingly. The katorga operated by its own brutal ethics, and those ethics had no patience for a man whose crimes had made him known, whose story had apparently reached even into the frozen depths of his Siberian imprisonment. He was 27 or 28 years old when he died. The 3 women he had murdered, Anna Blumentrost, 20 years old, Ekaterina Jaros, Maria Budiknikova, were in many ways younger still in terms of the lives they had not had the chance to live. The wounds he had inflicted on them, 12, 20, 35, were enumerated in the court records and would be enumerated again and again whenever the case was later examined. He had survived them by 7 years. 7 years of psychiatric evaluation and a trial and the katorga, and then a death at the hands of men whose names are not recorded and whose motives are documented only as the general violence of a population of the condemned. What the case of Nikolai Radkevich leaves behind in the historical record is not a story of a monster defeated by heroic investigation, though Vladimir Filipov and his detective team worked the case with genuine rigor and skill. It is not a story of justice in any satisfying sense, though the jury trial and the sentence were the justice that the Russian Empire's legal system was equipped to provide. It is, instead, a case study in what happens when personal trauma is processed not into healing but into ideology, when a wound becomes a worldview and a worldview becomes a license. Radkevich never recanted. He never expressed what most people would recognize as remorse. He had, by the time of his confession and the psychiatric evaluations, articulated a complete internal narrative in which what he had done made sense. In which the woman at the military school was the original perpetrator and every woman he had subsequently murdered was a continuation of the guilt she had introduced into the world. This narrative was, of course, an elaborate architecture of self-deception constructed over years to house the original, unprocessed explosion of a 14-year-old boy who had been deeply wronged and had never found any way to carry that wrongness except by putting it onto other people's bodies. The investigation itself deserves a moment's further attention, because it revealed something important about the limits and capabilities of early 20th century detective work operating under real pressure. Vladimir Filipov's team correctly identified the killer's typology early. One perpetrator, a pattern of victim selection, a consistent method. The witness descriptions, pooled and compared, produced a reliable composite. The height, the coat, the beard, those arms. The insight to cross-reference ship records with the dates of the attacks was the decisive analytical step, the point at which the investigation stopped chasing an alias and started pursuing a real person. The ship logs broke the case. Without them, Vadim Krovyanik might have remained a ghost in the city's records indefinitely. With them, Nikolai Radkevich became findable, and the bellhop at the Hotel Kio, alert in the corridor where he should by rights have been just another invisible employee in the background of a transient establishment, made the arrest possible by refusing to be silent when silence would have been the safer choice. The city of St. Petersburg moved on. It had other crises ahead of it. Within a decade, the revolution that was already being whispered about in 1909 would arrive in full force, and the empire whose streets Radkevich had walked would cease to exist. The Hotel Danube and the Hotel Kio would pass into the reorganized cityscape of what would become Leningrad. Ligovsky Avenue would endure. The Neva River would continue its dark rolling passage through the city, indifferent to what had been dropped into it in June of 1909. Anna Blumentrost's body had been recovered and identified. The other victims had been given the documentation of their deaths in court records. The case had been adjudicated, the sentence delivered, the prisoner dispatched. Radkevich's alias, Vadim the Bloodsucker, outlasted him. It passed into the records of Russian criminology as an early example of a type that would, in the decades that followed, become more formally understood and more extensively studied. Russia would produce other killers who operated with ideology and method, names that would become infamous in later Soviet and post-Soviet history. But Radkevich was early. He predated the frameworks. He existed in a legal and psychiatric environment that was still trying to find the vocabulary for what he represented. The disagreement between the psychiatrists who examined him, sadist versus degenerate, fully responsible versus constitutionally incapable of true moral reasoning, was not merely a procedural dispute. It was a preview of conversations that courts and psychiatrists and criminologists would be having for the next century and beyond. The inscription on his wall, "Death to Beauties," is perhaps the most enduring artifact of the case. Not because it explains anything, but because it crystallizes the absolute certainty with which Radkevich had armored himself against doubt. 3 words written into plaster by a young man who had decided that his rage was justice and his knife was an instrument of moral correction. 3 words that investigators found after he was already gone from the lodgings, already out in the city, already planning what would turn out to be his final murder. 3 words that made officers who read them go quiet in a particular way. The quietness that comes when you understand you are not dealing with disorder but with a kind of terrifying, twisted order. He is buried, most likely, somewhere in the Siberian landscape that received so many of the Russian empires condemned and forgotten. There is no monument. There is no grave marker that has been documented. There is the court record, the newspaper coverage of the time, the psychiatric reports, the ship logs, and the note left on the bed at the Hotel Kio beside the body of Maria Budiknikova, signed with an alias constructed from a word meaning blood. These are what remain of Nikolai Vladimirovich Radkevich, who was born around 1888 into an empire that was itself running out of time, who killed 3 women in 3 months of a St. Petersburg summer, and who died at the hands of his fellow prisoners before the sentence he had been given was even halfway served. The Neva River still flows through what is now called St. Petersburg again, after the long detour of Soviet renaming. The water is still dark at night. The city is still beautiful in the way that cities built for grandeur and soaked in history are beautiful, complicated and layered and carrying more than its share of weight. The women who moved through its streets in 1909 with yellow tickets in their pockets and careful eyes watching the men who approached them are long gone. But the summer they lived through, the summer of the long black coat and the skipper's beard and the knife that went in and kept going, is documented, is real, is part of the city's history whether the city particularly wants it or not. And somewhere in that history, in the margins of a story about an empire's final decades, a young man with disproportionately long arms and 3 words scratched onto his wall remains one of Russia's earliest documented serial killers. A reminder that the impulse to transform personal wound into public violence is not a modern phenomenon, not a product of any particular culture or century, but something that surfaces wherever the wrong combination of pain and pride and the complete absence of empathy exists in a single human being with access to a sharp edge and a dark river. The case of Nikolai Radkevich is closed, has been closed since 1909, but the questions it raises about how a boy becomes what he became, about the line between wound and weapon, about what justice looks like for victims who carried yellow tickets in a world that offered them so little protection, are not closed at all. They never really close. They simply wait, patient and unsettling, for the next time someone is willing to sit with them and ask them honestly what they mean. That is the story of Vadim the Bloodsucker. That is the truth of Nikolai Radkevich. And now you know it. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Mistress of Blood, Russia's most feared noblewoman. This is the story of Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova, aka Salty Chica, the she-demon of Troitsko. She wore silk gowns to church every Sunday, crossed herself before icons of the saints, and wept during hymns, while the screams of dying women still echoed from behind the walls of her estate. Before Jack the Ripper carved his name into the dark corners of criminal history, before Elizabeth Bathory bathed in the infamy of her own legend, there existed a woman so consumed by cruelty that an entire empire had to reckon with the monster it had allowed to breathe freely for over a decade. She was not a creature of shadows, not a faceless phantom that struck under cover of night. She was a noblewoman, a widow, a mother, a church-going socialite with blood-stained hands hidden beneath white gloves and pearls. Her name was Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova, and the peasants who worked her land simply called her Salty Chica, a name spoken in whispers so low, even the wind seemed afraid to carry it. She had servants who obeyed her. She had priests who blessed her. She had court connections that shielded her. And she had a killing floor that history would not forget. Welcome to the most disturbing true crime case to emerge from the blood-soaked soil of 18th century Imperial Russia. To understand what Daria Saltykova became, you must first understand what she was born into, and how perfectly that world was designed to manufacture exactly the kind of monster she turned out to be. On the 3rd day of November, in the year 1730, a girl was born into one of Moscow's most well-connected aristocratic families. Her father was Nikolai Avtonomovich Ivanov, and her mother, Anna Ivanovna Davidova, came from a lineage that ran alongside the Tolstoys, the Musin-Pushkins, and the Davidovs, families so deeply entrenched in Russian imperial society that their names alone opened closed doors and silenced loud voices. From her first breath, Daria Nikolaevna Ivanova was sheltered inside a world of gilded rooms and unquestioned privilege, where the only law that truly mattered was the law of class. Wealth was protection. Nobility was immunity. Power was the only currency that counted, and her family had an endless supply of it. Her childhood is largely obscured by history. No diaries survive, no intimate portraits of her early years exist. But what is known is that she grew up during a period when wealthy Russians were furiously importing culture from Western Europe. French fashions, German philosophies, Italian operas. The Russian elite was in the middle of a frenzied self-reinvention, striving to appear modern and civilized to the watching world. Beneath all that imported elegance, however, the brutal architecture of Russian feudalism remained absolutely untouched. Serfs, human beings bound to the land and to their masters by law, were treated not as people but as property. They could be bought and sold. They could be beaten. They could disappear without documentation, without consequence, and without anyone in power losing a single night's sleep over it. That world was the world Daria was born into. She absorbed its values as naturally as she absorbed the air. She married young, as was expected of women of her class. Her husband was Gleb Alexeyevich Saltykov, a nobleman whose family name she would carry, and eventually drag through the filth of history for the rest of her days. By most accounts, their marriage was neither particularly warm nor particularly troubled. It was a transaction between families of compatible status, formalized with vows and celebrated with feasts and forgotten as a romance almost immediately. The union produced two sons, Theodore, born in 1750, and Nicholas, born shortly after. Daria performed her aristocratic duties. She dressed well, attended the right events, maintained the appropriate appearances. Those who knew her during this period of her life described her as gloomy and withdrawn, a woman present in body but somehow absent in spirit, going through the motions of a life that seemed to bring her neither joy nor pain in any visible measure. And then her husband died. The year was 1755. Gleb Saltykov passed away under circumstances history has never clearly defined, and Daria, at the age of 26, became a widow. Not a ruined widow. Not a grieving widow in the romantic, theatrical sense of the word, but the richest widow in all of Moscow. With his death, she inherited the crown jewel of his estate, the breathtaking property known as Troitsko, situated not far from Moscow, nestled among forests and fields that stretched for what must have seemed, to any visitor, like the edge of the world. She also inherited more than 600 serfs, 600 human beings who now belonged to her, legally and entirely. 600 souls whose lives, safety, and fates rested on whatever mood happened to be living behind her eyes on any given morning. Her sons were sent away for their education, as was the custom. And so Daria Saltykova was left alone on her estate, alone with her servants, alone with her unraveling. What happened next is something historians have argued over for centuries, because the transformation, by all accounts, was neither gradual nor subtle. It was volcanic. It was complete. And the most chilling part is that no one, at the time, truly understood what was happening until the bodies began to pile up too high to ignore. The earliest theory historians return to again and again involves a man. Shortly after her husband's death, a land surveyor named Nikolai Tyachev, the grandfather of the future celebrated Russian poet Fyodor Tyachev, began a relationship with Daria. Whether the affair began before or after Gleb's death has never been definitively established, but by all accounts, Nikolai became the most significant emotional presence in Daria's life during those early widowed years. He was younger, connected, and by the standards of her world, an appropriate enough companion for a woman of her standing. She developed something that looked, from the outside, very much like obsession. She wanted him. She needed the validation of being chosen, of being wanted, of being seen by someone other than servants who had no choice but to bow to her. Nikolai Tyachev had other plans. He left her. He not only left her. He married a younger, red-haired woman and made no secret of his happiness. To a woman of Daria's temperament, proud, powerful, unaccustomed to rejection of any kind, this was not merely heartbreak. It was annihilation. It was a public humiliation from the one person she had allowed inside the walls. And when that door slammed shut, something behind her eyes shuddered permanently. The warmth, whatever little had existed, drained away entirely. What took its place was cold, deliberate, and catastrophic fury. The violence began in ways that could still be explained away, barely. A serf girl who cleaned improperly. a woman who mopped the floor incorrectly, a laundress who left a wrinkle in the linen. These were the initial pretexts, absurd, paper-thin pretexts, that Daria reached for when the heat inside her needed somewhere to go. In the beginning, she would hurl logs at her servant girls. Wooden logs, thrown with the full force of her body, aimed at the heads and backs of young women who stood frozen with fear, unsure whether flinching would make it worse. She would grab them by the hair and beat their faces with her bare fists, screaming with a ferocity that made the estate walls seem too thin to contain it. She beat them with whatever was nearest. Iron tongs pulled from the fireplace, still hot with ash. The long wooden handles of mops and brooms swung like weapons. Leather whips that left marks that never fully healed. But the beatings were just the beginning. What made Daria Saltykova different from the merely cruel? And there were many cruel masters in feudal Russia, many landowners who beat their serfs without consequence, was the escalation. The deliberate, almost methodical escalation. It was as though each act of violence whetted rather than sated something inside her, as though the pain of her victims fed something she could not name and could not stop feeding. She began to select specific victims with a disturbing pattern. Young women. The younger and more attractive they were, the more violently she seemed to despise them. It was as though she saw in their youth and femininity a reflection of everything Nikolai had chosen over her, and she could not tolerate its existence. She treated them not as rivals she could dismiss, but as enemies she needed to destroy. The methods diversified as the months turned and the years accumulated. She ordered women stripped naked in the dead of Russian winter and dragged outside into temperatures that could kill within minutes. She would leave them there, standing, kneeling, lying in the snow, and watch from the warmth of her windows. Some survived, broken by frostbite and shock. Others did not. She poured boiling water over the skin of her victims. Kettles of scalding liquid tipped deliberately over the heads, backs, and arms of young women who could do nothing but endure it. She beat pregnant women until they lost their unborn children, and kept beating them after. She ordered women to be held down while she struck them with heated metal instruments, pressing burning iron against flesh with a focused deliberateness that spoke not of rage but of something far more calculated and far more disturbing. One account, preserved through witness testimony and forensic investigation, describes a pregnant governess on the estate who was subjected to such prolonged and brutal torture that labor was induced during the beating itself. The woman died from the violence inflicted upon her. Her body, placed in a coffin by male servants who by then were complicit through sheer terror, was left outside in the frost. And her newborn child, a living infant, was placed on top of the coffin and left there in the cold, where it died. This was not a moment of impulsive rage. This was choreographed cruelty. Another account describes a young serf girl driven at the point of a stick to the edge of a pond on the estate grounds. She was forced into the water, cold, dark water in the Russian countryside, and made to stand neck-deep while Daria watched. After several hours in the freezing water, unable to move, unable to escape, the girl drowned. Whether she drowned from the cold, from exhaustion, or from the slow surrender of a body that had been given no reason to keep fighting, no witness could say for certain. What they could say is that Daria watched. She almost always watched. The estate became a place of whispered dread throughout the surrounding regions. Serfs spoke of it in hushed voices. The women who worked inside its walls lived in a state of suspended terror, never knowing which morning would be the morning she woke in the wrong mood, which small imperfection in their work would be enough to make her reach for the fire tongs. The male servants on the estate were also trapped, not primary targets of her violence, but accessories to it. She ordered them to hold women down while she beat them. She ordered them to carry bodies. She ordered them to maintain silence, and they obeyed, because the consequences of disobedience in Daria Saltykova's world were something no rational person wanted to test. Meanwhile, complaints began to trickle outward. The families of dead servants, the surviving relatives of women who had entered Troitsko and never returned. Petitions were written. Formal complaints were lodged with local authorities. And those complaints were systematically dismissed, buried, ignored, or, in some cases, turned back on the petitioners themselves, who were punished for the audacity of accusing a noblewoman of their class with no evidence beyond the testimony of people who legally own nothing, not even themselves. This is the part of the Salty Chica story that history must not be allowed to gloss over. She killed for years without interruption, not because the killings were secret, but because the system around her was designed to protect people exactly like her. Power was not incidental to her crimes. It was the engine of them. Without her connections to the royal court, without her family's standing, without the fundamental legal invisibility of her victims, she would never have lasted as long as she did. The institution of serfdom did not merely provide her with victims, provided her with permission, and still the dying continued. By the time Daria Saltykova's killing years reached their fullest and most brutal expression, the estate at Troitsko had become something that defied the imagination of people who had never stood inside its walls. It was, on the surface, a grand and beautiful property, the kind of Russian countryside estate that Western visitors would write home about in letters filled with admiration for its architecture and grounds. Forests surrounded it. Fields stretched out from its edges. The house itself was stately and furnished with the kind of excess that only inherited generational wealth can produce. Visitors were received politely. The table was set with silver. The candles were tall and properly placed. And somewhere in that same house, women were being tortured to death. The full accounting of Daria Saltykova's victims is one of the most contested and troubling elements of her case. And the uncertainty itself tells a story. Forensic investigators and court officials, examining the records of the Troitsko estate during the 6-year investigation that followed her arrest, identified approximately 138 suspicious deaths that they believed were connected to her. Of that number, only 38 were officially confirmed, not because the investigators doubted the rest, but because the surviving witnesses were so paralyzed by fear that they refused to testify. They had watched what happened to those who crossed Salty Chica. They had seen what she was capable of, and many of them simply could not bring themselves to believe that even Empress Catherine II's court could truly protect them from a woman who had demonstrated, over the course of a decade, that no authority in their immediate world would lift a finger on their behalf. The victims were overwhelmingly women and girls. Young women. The youngest documented victims were girls of 10 and 12 years old. Children, in other words, children who worked in her household and died in it. 3 of the confirmed victims were men. Everyone else was female. The pattern was so consistent that investigators noted it explicitly, and it aligned with what survivors described. Daria Saltykova had a particular and almost exclusive focus on the women in her service, and the younger and more attractive they were, the more intensely she seemed to target them. The killing methods recorded during the investigation read less like the impulsive acts of a woman losing control and more like the practiced repertoire of someone who had developed preferences, who had discovered, through experimentation, what she enjoyed most, what gave her the most prolonged sense of power and satisfaction. She favored beating above all else, but not simple beating, not the swift and brutal kind that ends quickly. Her beatings were extended, theatrical performances of violence. She used her fists, bare and bleeding from the force she put behind them. She used wooden rods snapped from furniture and from the estate's outbuildings. She used the iron fire tongs that hung beside every fireplace in the house, pulling them free and bringing them down on the bodies of her victims with both hands. In winter, she would move the beating outside, not to spare her floors the mess, but because the cold added an additional dimension of suffering. Women beaten in sub-zero temperatures experienced a particular kind of agony. The cold made flesh more fragile. Wounds opened more easily. The body shut down more quickly. She also used fire. Multiple witness accounts describe incidents in which Daria used heated instruments against the skin of her servants. Metal objects brought to temperature in the fireplace and then pressed against arms, backs, faces. This was not accidental. There is no scenario in which a person repeatedly heats metal and applies it to human skin without knowing exactly what they are doing and choosing to do it regardless. The burns described in testimony were deliberate and targeted, the kind that required the victim to be held in place, which is where the male servants came in. They were the instruments of restraint, ordered to hold struggling women still while their mistress applied her work. The boiling water incidents were among the most frequently mentioned by witnesses. It appeared to be a method Daria returned to with particular regularity, perhaps because it required minimal physical effort on her part, perhaps because the results were immediate and dramatic. Kettles and pots of water, heated to full boil in the kitchen, carried upstairs or into whatever room the chosen victim occupied, tipped over them. Multiple witnesses described hearing screaming from within the estate that could carry across the grounds and into the surrounding areas. Screaming that went on and then stopped, and the stillness that followed was somehow worse than the screaming. She tortured pregnant women with a specific and focused cruelty that set her apart even from the most brutal of her contemporaries. The deliberate targeting of pregnancy, of the visible physical evidence of a woman's body producing new life, seemed to provoke something in Daria that went beyond mere sadism into a territory that modern criminal psychologists would likely connect to deep-seated obsession with fertility, youth, and desirability. She beat pregnant women. She kicked them. She had them forced into cold environments for prolonged periods. She did not stop when miscarriage occurred. She continued. Several of these women died. At least one died in induced labor during an active torture session, as documented in surviving testimony. The case of the governess and the frozen infant, already mentioned but impossible to move past without returning to it, stands as perhaps the single most viscerally disturbing incident in the entire case record. Pregnant woman, tortured until she gave birth, the woman dying from her injuries, and then the living child, her newborn, placed atop her coffin in the Russian frost by servants too broken by fear to do otherwise. That infant died there. A human life, minutes old, extinguished not by a weapon but by abandonment. Abandonment ordered, implicitly or explicitly, by a woman who was still alive, still warm, still inside the house. One of the most bizarre elements of Daria's violence was its domestic trigger system. Unlike many serial killers whose violence is connected to predetermined victim selection or ritualistic patterns, Daria Saltykova's eruptions began with household tasks. Improperly scrubbed floors, laundry she deemed inadequately clean, a meal she found displeasingly prepared. These mundane domestic observations acted as fuses. The smallest imperfection in household management was enough to detonate the full force of her violence on whoever was nearest. This created an environment of impossible, perpetual anxiety for the women in her service. There was no standard high enough to meet, no floor clean enough, no dish prepared to adequate satisfaction. The goalposts were not merely moving. They were imaginary. The violence was coming regardless. The domestic inadequacy was simply the story she told herself and others to justify it. There is also the extraordinary matter of Nikolai Tyachev, the man whose rejection appears to have ignited all of this, and Daria's attempt to extend her violence beyond the serf population. After Tyachev married his younger, red-haired wife and publicly moved on from Daria's life, she did not move on from his. She brooded. She planned. And then she ordered her servants to plant a bomb, an explosive device, in the house where Tyachev and his new wife lived. This was not a moment of blind rage. This was premeditated attempted murder of a nobleman, a crime of an entirely different legal category from the killing of serfs, a crime that could not be brushed aside by court connections. Her servants, who had obeyed every previous order regardless of what it required them to do, drew the line here. They refused. And rather than carry out the order, they warned Tyachev instead. Daria, undeterred by the failure, formulated a second plan, an ambush of Tyachev and his wife while their carriage traveled through the countryside. She organized it. She planned the timing. And again, the servants warned Tyachev. Again, the plan collapsed. She never succeeded in killing him. But the planning itself, the calculated, patient, multi-step scheming directed at a specific named target, reveals something important about who she was. This was not a woman who acted purely on impulse, who committed violence because she couldn't control herself. The violence against her serfs was chosen, too. It was simply chosen in a context where the consequences were, for years, non-existent. Meanwhile, the body count accumulated. Women came to Troitsko to work and did not come back. Their families received no explanations. Official records listed causes of death with clinical brevity. Illness, accident, fall, undetermined cause. The estate's records were clean on paper in the way that powerful people's records are always clean on paper when the machinery of power is working in their favor. Local officials who received complaints turned the complaints over to Daria's allies. Petitioners were punished. Some were sent back to the very estate they had fled from. The message was consistent and merciless. This woman is untouchable. Stop asking questions. Stop expecting answers. Go back to your place. For years, the better part of a decade, that message held. And then, in the summer of 1762, two men decided they had nothing left to lose. Their names were Ermolay Aline and Sokvy Martinov, and they were serfs who had worked on Daria Saltykova's estate long enough to have witnessed horrors that no human being should be required to carry in silence. Ermolay Aline's loss was of a magnitude almost impossible to absorb. 3 of his wives, 3 separate women he had been bound to in marriage, had been beaten to death on Daria's orders. Not one wife, 3 consecutive losses, each one taken from him by the same pair of hands, in the same estate, under the same sky. The weight of that loss and the years of silence required to survive while carrying it had compacted into something that finally, in the summer of 1762, broke through all the fear and resigned acceptance that serfdom demanded of a person. Ermolay and Sokvy fled. They ran not to local authorities, they had learned what local authorities were worth in this particular context, but all the way to St. Petersburg, to the court of the recently installed Empress Catherine II. It was an extraordinary act of desperation and courage. 2 men of the lowest legal social class in Russian society, traveling to the seat of imperial power, requesting an audience with the most powerful woman in the world, carrying nothing but the truth of what they had witnessed and what they had lost. To the enduring credit of Catherine II, a ruler whose record is complex and frequently contradictory, she heard them. She ordered the College of Justice to open a formal investigation into the deaths at the Saltykova estate. And in 1762, for the first time in her reign of blood and terror, Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova was arrested. The arrest of Daria Saltykova in 1762 was not the beginning of the end of her story. It was the beginning of a 6-year ordeal that tested the limits of imperial justice and revealed, in excruciating detail, just how thoroughly a powerful woman could resist accountability even when the entire weight of the state was theoretically arrayed against her. She was held in custody while the College of Justice, the investigative body charged by Catherine II with examining the case, began the work of reconstructing what had happened at Troitsko over the preceding years. It was not simple work. The evidence was buried under layers of fear, corruption, and the systemic silencing of witnesses who had every reason to believe that speaking the truth could still get them killed or worse. The investigator most responsible for keeping the case alive was a man named Stepan Volkov. His role in this story deserves more recognition than history has typically given him. He was methodical, thorough, and apparently immune to the social pressure that had caused every previous official to look the other way. Volkov examined the estate's records. He reviewed the death registrations of serfs on the property, which were legally required to be kept. And what he found was a pattern so stark and so statistically impossible that no legitimate interpretation existed other than murder. The death rate among the women and girls in Daria Saltykova's service was extraordinary by any measure. Women died at Troitsko at rates that no disease, no accident, no natural cause could explain. The numbers told a story even before a single witness came forward to speak. But witnesses were needed, and witnesses were terrified. The surviving serfs who had worked at Troitsko during Daria's killing years were confronted with an agonizing calculation. On one side, the chance that Catherine's court would actually hold a noblewoman accountable, something that had quite literally never happened before in Russian history. On the other side, the memory of what Daria Saltykova had done to people who crossed her, people who complained about her, people who simply looked at her in a way she didn't appreciate. The fear was not irrational. It was the product of years of accumulated evidence that this woman operated without consequences. Several witnesses refused entirely. Others gave limited testimony, enough to confirm specific incidents but not enough to paint the full picture. The full picture was something many of them had simply locked away in parts of themselves they refused to open. Daria herself was moved into detention and held throughout the investigation. and her behavior in custody was one of the most remarkable and chilling aspects of the entire case. She did not weep. She did not beg. She did not offer any of the performances of remorse or contrition that the court might have been prepared to receive. She was cold, composed, and absolutely certain that she would not be punished. Absolutely certain. The confidence was not bravado. It was genuine. She had lived her entire life in a world where the rules did not apply to her, and she saw no reason, even now, even in a cell, to revise that understanding. She was a Saltykova. She had connections. The Empress would lose interest. The case would collapse. She would return to Troitsko. Even the priest assigned to her, a clergyman whose specific task was to encourage her to confess her sins and seek absolution before God, could not move her. He spent time with her. He prayed with her. He appealed to her faith, to whatever remained of the woman who had crossed herself in church every Sunday and wept during hymns. And she gave him nothing, no confession, no admission, no crack in the facade of absolute self-assurance. She would not speak the words that she had done anything wrong, because somewhere in the architecture of her psychology, she did not believe that she had. The investigation lasted 6 years. 6 years during which Stepan Volkov continued to build his case brick by painstaking brick, crossing witness accounts with estate records, mapping deaths against dates and circumstances, constructing from fragments the most comprehensive picture possible of what had occurred on that estate. The College of Justice, examining everything Volkov assembled, concluded that approximately 138 deaths at Troitsko were suspicious and likely connected to Daria Saltykova. They could not confirm all 138 to the legal standard required. The confirmed figure, the number against which the prosecution could build an airtight case, was 38. 38 individual human beings, mostly women and girls, beaten, burned, frozen, scalded, and drowned to death. Only 38. That number carries a bitter irony that should not be lost. The remaining 100-odd deaths, human beings, real people with families and histories, could not be officially confirmed because the system that had allowed Daria to kill them in the first place was the same system now struggling to posthumously account for them. The fear she had cultivated so effectively during her killing years became, in the end, a kind of retroactive protection against the full weight of justice. The dead could not speak for themselves, and the living who had watched them die were still afraid. Daria was formally declared not to be suffering from any mental illness. This determination was important in the context of her eventual sentencing, because it removed any possibility of a defense based on incapacity. She was sane. She was present. She understood what she had done and had done it deliberately, repeatedly, over the course of years, with planning and with intent. The court was dealing not with a woman who had lost control of herself, but with a woman who had exercised complete and calculated control over others. The broader legal context of Russia in 1768 created a specific complication in sentencing. The death penalty had been abolished in Russia in 1754, 14 years before Daria's conviction, meaning that the most obvious and proportionate response to her crimes was legally unavailable. Catherine, too, was also navigating a delicate political landscape. She needed the support of the Russian nobility, and publicly executing or severely degrading one of their own, even one as monstrous as Daria Saltykova, carried political risks that the Empress was keenly aware of. She had to balance the demands of justice with the practicalities of power. The solution she arrived at was ingenious in its cruelty. A cruelty far more refined than anything involving physical pain, aimed instead at the one thing Daria Saltykova valued above all else, her social standing. Before sentencing was formally announced, Catherine too took the extraordinary step of stripping Daria of her noble title. Not quietly, not through paperwork, but publicly, in a declaration that made clear to all of Russian society that this woman was no longer one of them. The name Saltykova, once a mark of wealth and privilege, was to become instead a synonym for something monstrous. Catherine renamed her officially, in the court documents, not as Daria Saltykova but as this inhumane woman. A deliberate act of erasure, a public declaration that the identity she had used as a weapon and a shield was being removed from her permanently. Then came the sentencing. In 1768, 6 years after her arrest, Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova was brought to the Red Square in Moscow. the heart of Russian public life, the center of the city, surrounded by the Kremlin, by the churches, by the crowds that gathered whenever history was about to be made in a public and permanent way. She was chained to a platform. A sign was hung around her neck. The sign read, "Without embellishment and without mercy, this woman tortured and murdered." And she stood there in chains in public for over an hour. The woman who had spent years inflicting humiliation on those who could not resist it now stood before the people of Moscow in her own humiliation. The crowds came to see her. They came to look at her face, at the woman behind the legend, at the noblewoman who had eaten her serfs alive for the better part of a decade while the authorities looked away. Whatever passed across her features during that hour, and history does not record it clearly, she survived it. She did not collapse. She did not weep. She was, even in this, composed. After the public display, she was transferred to the Ivanovsky convent, the St. John the Baptist convent in Moscow, which had long served as a place of incarceration for women of noble blood who could not be sent to ordinary prisons without violating the customs of class. But Daria's imprisonment within the convent was specifically designed to be as severe as the law now permitted. She was not given a cell in the general convent population. She was placed in a specifically constructed underground chamber. A pit, essentially, sealed below the convent, lit, when lit at all, by a single candle. The chamber had a small window through which food was passed. She saw no sunlight. She felt no open air. She heard no human voices in conversation, no laughter, no music, no birdsong from the gardens above her. She heard nothing except the slow accumulation of years. She would spend the rest of her life in that underground room. The underground chamber beneath the Ivanovsky convent was not a cell in the conventional sense. It was a burial chamber for the living, and inside it, for 33 years, Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova. Once the richest widow in Moscow, once the untouchable noblewoman of Troitsko, once the terror whose name made grown men lower their voices, existed in a state of prolonged, structured isolation designed to last until she was no longer capable of existing at all. She was 61 years old when she entered that darkness. She would be 71 when she died inside it. 33 years. Try to hold that measurement against what you know of time. 33 years is long enough to watch a child become a middle-aged adult. It is long enough for the world outside to change beyond recognition. Empires shift, rulers die, cities rebuild, entire generations come and go while you remain beneath the ground, in silence, in the dark, with nothing but the weight of what you did pressing down on whatever is left of who you are. The accounts of her behavior during those decades underground are fragmentary but deeply revealing. Prisoners and visitors to the convent occasionally passed near her chamber. In the early years, it was reported that she would rage against the walls when visitors came close, screaming through the small window, shouting curses and denunciations, exhibiting the same violent eruptions that had characterized her years at Troitsko. This was, in its own disturbing way, recognizable as the woman she had always been. The confinement had not broken her immediately. The ego that had sustained her absolute certainty of escaping punishment, the contempt for those she considered beneath her, the volcanic fury that lived so close to her surface, all of it was still present, still operational, still alive. But the years ground it down. The reports that accumulated over subsequent decades showed a different portrait. The raging stopped, eventually. The shouting stopped. What replaced it was something observers found, in its way, even more unsettling than the violence. A profound and complete withdrawal. A woman who seemed to have retreated to somewhere so far inside herself that nothing external, not voices, not presence, not even light on the rare occasions when the chamber was entered, seemed to register. The mind, deprived long enough of human connection, human exchange, human presence, will find ways to survive, but those ways are not always recognizable as what we call sanity. By the final decade of her confinement, those who had occasion to observe or interact with her described a woman who was, in any meaningful psychological sense, no longer entirely present. The sharp, calculating intelligence that had maneuvered through the imperial court system for years, that had covered its tracks in blood for a decade, that had stood unmoved before priests and investigators and the crowds of Red Square, that intelligence had curdled and collapsed. She died on the 27th of December, 1801, having outlived several of her former champions at court and most of the people who had known her in her years of terror. She was 71 years old, which was, in the context of 18th century Russia, a remarkable longevity for a woman who had spent the last third of her life underground. History does not record what killed her. The cause was listed as unknown, which feels somehow appropriate for a case filled throughout with things that were seen but not recorded, known but not confirmed, felt but not proven. What followed her death was something she could never have predicted and would never have chosen. She became, over the generations that came after her, one of the most enduringly discussed figures in Russian cultural memory. The name Saltychika, the name the peasants had whispered in fear, entered the Russian language as a permanent term. Not a name, a category, a description. To call someone a Saltychika in Russia was to accuse them of the most bestial, most dehumanizing abuse of power imaginable. The name survived her by centuries and carries its meaning still, which is perhaps the most ironic of all possible afterlives for a woman whose entire identity was built on the belief that she was untouchable and would never be defined by anyone else's judgment of her. Historians and criminal profilers in the centuries following her death have returned to her case repeatedly, each era finding in it a slightly different set of questions worth asking. The 19th century saw her primarily as a symbol of aristocratic excess and the moral corruption of serfdom, a cautionary tale aimed at the feudal system itself rather than at the individual woman within it. The 20th century, particularly as criminal psychology developed as a formal discipline, began examining her through a more individual lens. What made her? What broke inside her? What does her case tell us about the internal architecture of a female serial killer in a world that refused, for years, to even recognize that such a thing could exist? Because that is one of the most significant aspects of the Saltychika case when examined from a modern perspective. The systemic invisibility of her crimes was not purely a product of her personal connections, though those connections mattered enormously. It was also a product of a collective cultural assumption that a woman of her class, a woman who attended church and wept during hymns and received guests at a polished table, simply could not be what she was. The violence was reported. The complaints were filed. The bodies were acknowledged. And still, for over a decade, the conclusion that a noblewoman was systematically murdering her servants was a conclusion that the system refused to reach. Because systems, particularly aristocratic ones, are invested in the innocence of their own members in ways that truth cannot easily penetrate. The comparison to Elizabeth Bathory of Hungary, which historians have made repeatedly and which bears examination, is instructive precisely because of where it breaks down. Bathory is estimated to have killed somewhere between 80 and 650 young women, depending on which sources you credit, over a period of decades in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Both women were noble women. Both targeted primarily young women and girls from lower social classes. Both operated with a degree of impunity made possible by their social standing. Both were ultimately held accountable only when the scale of their crimes became so large that even the systems designed to protect them could no longer absorb it without rupturing. The parallels are real and worth noting. But Bathory had the cover of a remote Hungarian castle and an era in which communication between regions was slow and unreliable. Daria Saltykova operated within a reasonable distance of Moscow, one of the most populated and politically active cities in the Russian Empire. Her crimes were not rural secrets whispered only among local peasants. The evidence was closer, the complaints were louder, and the authorities who ignored them were doing so in full view of an imperial court that could, in principle, have acted years earlier. The protection she received was not incidental. It was chosen, repeatedly, consciously, and by people who understood exactly what they were choosing. This is why Catherine II's decision to try her publicly, rather than quietly and privately as some at court preferred, was so politically significant. Catherine understood that the way she handled Saltychika would send a message about what kind of ruler she intended to be, what kind of society she intended to govern, and what limits she was prepared to place on the assumption of noble immunity that had functioned as an invisible law for generations. By bringing Daria to Red Square in chains, by hanging that sign around her neck, by putting her underground for the rest of her natural life rather than offering her the quiet, comfortable exile that her class would normally have secured, Catherine was making a statement. Whether that statement ultimately changed anything about the treatment of serfs in Imperial Russia, whether it represented a genuine shift in the moral framework of the empire or merely a single spectacular exception to rules that otherwise continued undisturbed, is something historians continue to debate. The institution of serfdom itself would not be abolished until 1861, 60 years after Daria's death. But within the history of criminal justice, within the narrow and specific question of whether powerful people could be held accountable for what they did to those beneath them, the Salty Chica case stands as something genuinely unusual for its time and place. A noblewoman convicted, a noblewoman punished publicly, a noblewoman stripped of her identity and her title and sentenced to die in a hole in the ground. The case also exists as an early and extraordinary entry in the history of female serial killers, a history that both popular culture and formal criminal psychology have consistently underexamined relative to their male counterparts. The profile of Salty Chica, as reconstructed through modern analysis, aligns with certain patterns that researchers have identified in female serial killers. The domestic setting, the targeted victims drawn from the immediate environment, the prolonged time frame, the element of power and control as primary motivator. But she also defies easy categorization, because the world she inhabited, the specific legal and social architecture of 18th-century feudal Russia, created conditions for her violence that have no direct contemporary parallel. She did not need to be stealthy in the way that most killers do. She did not need to dispose of evidence in the way that most killers do. She needed only to maintain her social position and rely on the protection of a system that treated her victims' lives as legally negligible. The 38 officially confirmed victims of Daria Saltykova are named in historical records where those names survived. Many of them did not survive. Many of the women and girls who died on that estate remained unrecorded in any meaningful sense. Not because their deaths were secret, but because their lives were never considered important enough to document thoroughly. Their names were not preserved the way the names of nobility were preserved. Their stories were not written down in the way that the stories of those with power were written down. They existed as serfs, and serfs were property, and property does not get its own historical record unless someone with the power to grant one makes the deliberate choice to do so. Among the confirmed dead, the records that survive speak of women in their teens and 20s, of a young girl aged 12, of another girl aged 10, of a pregnant woman tortured into labor and left to die while her newborn froze above her coffin. These are not statistics. These were people. They had names. They had families. Families who filed petitions, who walked to St. Petersburg, who risked punishment to testify, who spent years trying to make powerful people care about the deaths of people who were not powerful. Ermolay Aline, who lost 3 wives to her violence, is remembered by name in this case primarily because his courage in bringing a petition before Catherine II was the act that finally cracked the wall of protection around Salty Chica. The 3 women he lost are mentioned in relation to him, defined by their connection to his story, which is itself a small and troubling echo of the invisibility that defined their lives and deaths. The legacy of the Salty Chica case should be understood on multiple levels simultaneously. On the level of individual criminal history, it is the story of a woman who made a series of choices, not compulsions, not madness, but deliberate choices, to destroy the lives of the most vulnerable people within her reach, and who did so for years because no one with power over her chose to stop her. On the level of systemic history, it is the story of a society that created the conditions for exactly this kind of predation and then expressed shock and moral outrage when those conditions produced exactly the predator they were designed to produce. On the level of criminal justice history, it is one of the earliest documented cases in which female serial violence was formally acknowledged, investigated, prosecuted, and punished imperfectly partially with a sentence that could never be proportionate to what she had done, but punished nonetheless. And on the level of sheer human darkness, the level at which true crime takes hold of us, the level at which we cannot stop listening no matter how much we wish we could, the Salty Chica case endures because it asks questions that we have never fully answered. How does a person become this? How does a woman who wept in church on Sunday become the woman who poured boiling water on a girl's face on Monday? How does grief and rejection and power and impunity combine inside a human being to produce something that looks, from the outside, completely normal, and is, on the inside, something we do not have an adequate word for. Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova died in the dark, in a hole, alone. The women she killed were buried in the ground of Troitsko, without ceremony, without markers, without anyone above them who mourned them in a way that history recorded. The estate stood long after she was gone. The forests around it stood longer still. The name Saltychika outlasted all of it. And somewhere in the specific horror of that, the way a name built on terror lives longer than either the terror or its victims. There is a truth about power and memory and the strange, terrible permanence of the worst things human beings do to one another that no amount of distance or time has yet managed to quiet. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.